Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Here, at this final hour, in this quiet place, Harlem has come to bid farewell to one of its brightest hopes, extinguished now and gone from us forever. It is not in the memory of man that this beleaguered, unfortunate, but nonetheless proud community has found a braver, more gallant young champion than this Afro-American who lies before us, unconquered still. I say the word again as he would want me to, Afro-American. Afro-American Malcolm. Malcolm had stopped being Negro years ago. It had become too small, too puny, too weak a word for him. Malcolm was bigger than that. Malcolm had become an Afro-American, and he wanted so desperately that all his people would become Afro-Americans too. There are those who still consider it their duty as friends of the Negro people to tell us to revile him, to flee even from the presence of his memory, to save ourselves by writing him out of the history of our turbulent times. And we will smile. They will say that he is of hate, a fanatic, a racist, who can only bring evil to the cause for which you struggle. And we will answer and say unto them, did you ever talk to Brother Malcolm? Did you ever touch him or have him smile at you? Did you ever really listen to him?
You haven't done the right thing.
Was he ever himself associated with violence or any public disturbance? For if you did, you would know him. And if you knew him, you would know why we must honor him. Malcolm was our manhood, our living black manhood. This was his meaning to his people, and in honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves. However much we may have differed with him, or with each other about him and his value as a man, let his going from us serve only to bring us together now. Consigning these mortal remains to earth, the common mother of all, secure in the knowledge that what we place in the ground is no more now a man, but a seed, which after the winter of our discontent will come forth again to meet us, and we shall know him then for what he was and is, a prince, our own black shining prince, who didn't hesitate to die because he loved us so.
Context of white supremacy. Gus T. Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, February 13th, 2015. So I have been told. This is the 8th biography that we've done in our book study session. We've done Dr. Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. We've done Melba Patilla Beals, Warriors Don't Cry. President Barack Obama, Dreams from My Father. Richard Williams, Black and White, The Way I See It. Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave. Chris Kyle, American Sniper. And now, Minister Malcolm X, the Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley, Context of White Supremacy.
Side 1. The Autobiography of Malcolm X, with the assistance of Alex Haley. Introduction by M.S. Handler. Epilogue by Alex Haley. Copyright 1964 by Alex Haley and Malcolm X. Copyright 1965 by Alex Haley and Betty Shabazz. Introduction copyright 1965 by M.S. Handler. Narrated by Earl Hyman. This book contains 460 pages on 13 sides. This book I dedicate to my beloved wife Betty and to our children, whose understanding and whose sacrifices made it possible for me to do my work. Contents. Introduction, Side 1. Chapter 1, Nightmare, Side 1. Chapter 2, Mascot, Side 1. Chapter 3, Homeboy, Side 2. Chapter 4, Laura, Side 2. Chapter 5, Harlemite, Side 3. Chapter 6, Detroit Red, Side 3. Chapter 7, Hustler, Side 3. Chapter 8, Trapped, Side 4. Chapter 9, Caught, Side 4. Chapter 10, Satan, Side 4. Chapter 11, Saved, Side 5. Chapter 12, Savior, Side 6. Chapter 13, Minister Malcolm X, Side 6. Chapter 14, Black Muslims, Side 7. Chapter 15, Icarus, Side 8. Chapter 16, Out, Side 8. Chapter 17, Mecca, Side 9. Chapter 18, El Hajj Malik, El Shabazz, Side 10. Chapter 19, 1965, Side 10. Alex Haley, Epilogue, Side 11. R.C. Davis, on Malcolm X, Side 13. M.S. Handler, Introduction. The Sunday before he was to officially announce his rupture with Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X came to my home to discuss his plans and give me some necessary documentation. Mrs. Handler had never met Malcolm before this fateful visit. She served us coffee and cakes while Malcolm spoke in the courteous, gentle manner that was his in private. It was obvious to me that Mrs. Handler was impressed by Malcolm. His personality filled our living room. Malcolm's attitude was that of a man who had reached a crossroads in his life and was making a choice under an inner compulsion. A wistful smile illuminated his countenance from time to time, a smile that said many things. I felt uneasy because Malcolm was evidently trying to say something which his pride and dignity prevented him from expressing. I sensed that Malcolm was not confident he would succeed in escaping from the shadowy world which had held him in thrall. Mrs. Handler was quiet and thoughtful after Malcolm's departure. Looking up suddenly, she said, "You know, it was like having tea with a black panther." The description startled me. The Black Panther is an aristocrat in the animal kingdom. He is beautiful. He is dangerous. As a man, Malcolm X had the physical bearing and the inner self-confidence of a born aristocrat, and he was potentially dangerous. No man in our time aroused fear and hatred in the white man as did Malcolm, because in him the white man sensed an implacable foe who could not be had for any price. A man unreservedly committed to the cause of liberating the black man in American society, rather than integrating the black man into that society. My first meeting with Malcolm X took place in March 1963 in the Muslim restaurant of Temple No. 7 on Lenox Avenue. I'd been assigned by the New York Times to investigate the growing pressures within the Negro community. 30 years of experience as a reporter in Western and Eastern Europe had taught me that the forces in a developing social struggle are frequently buried beneath the visible surface and make themselves felt in many ways long before they burst out into the open. These generative forces make themselves felt through the power of an idea long before their organizational forms can openly challenge the establishment. It is the merit of European political scientists and sociologists to give a high priority to the power of ideas in a social struggle. In the United States, it is our weakness to confuse the numerical strength of an organization and the publicity attached to leaders with the germinating forces that sow the seeds of social upheaval in our community. In studying the growing pressures within the Negro community, I had not only to seek the opinions of the established leaders of the civil rights organizations, but the opinions of those working in the penumbra of the movement, underground, so to speak. This is why I sought out Malcolm X, whose ideas had reached me through the medium of Negro integrationists. Their thinking was already reflecting a high degree of nascent Negro nationalism. I did not know what to expect as I waited for Malcolm. I was the only white person in the restaurant, an immaculate establishment tended by somber, handsome, uncommunicative Negroes. Signs reading, "Smoking Forbidden," were pasted on the highly polished mirrors. I was served coffee, but became uneasy in this aseptic, silent atmosphere as time passed. Malcolm finally arrived. He was very tall, handsome, of impressive bearing. His skin had a bronze hue. I rose to greet him and extended my hand. Malcolm's hand came up slowly. I had the impression it was difficult for him to take my hand, but, noblesse oblige, he did. Malcolm then did a curious thing which he always repeated whenever we met in public in a restaurant in New York or Washington. He asked whether I would mind if he took a seat facing the door. I'd had similar requests put to me in Eastern European capitals. Malcolm was on the alert. He wished to see every person who entered the restaurant. I quickly realized that Malcolm constantly walked in danger. We spoke for more than 3 hours at this first encounter. His views about the white man were devastating, but at no time did he transgress against my own personality and make me feel that I, as an individual, shared in the guilt. He attributed the degradation of the Negro people to the white man. He denounced integration as a fraud. He contended that if the leaders of the established civil rights organizations persisted, the social struggle would end in bloodshed because he was certain the white man would never concede full integration. He argued the Muslim case for separation as the only solution in which the Negro could achieve his own identity, develop his own culture, and lay the foundations for a self-respecting, productive community. He was vague about where the Negro state could be established. Malcolm refused to see the impossibility of the white man conceding secession from the United States. At this stage in his career, he contended it was the only solution. He defended Islam as a religion that did not recognize color bars. He denounced Christianity as a religion designed for slaves, and the Negro clergy as the curse of the black man, exploiting him for their own purposes instead of seeking to liberate him and acting as handmaidens of the white community in its determination to keep the Negroes in a subservient position. During this first encounter, Malcolm also sought to enlighten me about the Negro mentality. He repeatedly cautioned me to beware of Negro affirmations of goodwill toward the white man. He said that the Negro had been trained to dissemble and conceal his real thoughts as a matter of survival. He argued that the Negro only tells the white man what he believes the white man wishes to hear, and that the art of dissembling reached a point where even Negroes cannot truthfully say they understand what their fellow Negroes believe. The art of deception practiced by the Negro was based on a thorough understanding of the white man's mores, he said. At the same time, the Negro has remained a closed book to the white man, who has never displayed any interest in understanding the Negro. Malcolm's exposition of his social ideas was clear and thoughtful, if somewhat shocking to the white initiate. But most disconcerting in our talk was Malcolm's belief in Elijah Muhammad's history of the origins of man, and in a genetic theory devised to prove the superiority of black over white, a theory stunning to me in its sheer absurdity. After this first encounter, I realized that there were two Malcolms, the private and the public person. His public performances on television and at meeting halls produced an almost terrifying effect. His implacable marshalling of facts and his logic had something of a new dialectic, diabolic in its force. He frightened white television audiences, demolished his Negro opponents, but elicited a remarkable response from Negro audiences. Many Negro opponents in the end refused to make any public appearances on the same platform with him. The troubled white audiences were confused, disturbed, felt themselves threatened. Some began to consider Malcolm evil incarnate. Malcolm appealed to the two most disparate elements in the Negro community, the depressed mass and the galaxy of Negro writers and artists who burst on the American scene in the past decade. The Negro middle class, the Negro establishment, abhorred and feared Malcolm as much as he despised it. The impoverished Negroes respected Malcolm in the way that wayward children respect the grandfather image. It was always a strange and moving experience to walk with Malcolm in Harlem. He was known to all. People glanced at him shyly. Sometimes Negro youngsters would ask for his autograph. It always seemed to me that their affection for Malcolm was inspired by the fact that although he had become a national figure, he was still a man of the people who they felt would never betray them. The Negroes have suffered too long from betrayals, and in Malcolm they sensed a man of mission. They knew his origins, with which they could identify. They knew his criminal and prison record, which he had never concealed. They looked upon Malcolm with a certain wonderment. Here was a man who had come from the lower depths which they still inhabited, who had triumphed over his own criminality and his own ignorance to become a forceful leader and spokesman, an uncompromising champion of his people. Although many could not share his Muslim religious beliefs, they found in Malcolm's Puritanism a standing reproach to their own lives. Malcolm had purged himself of all the ills that afflict the depressed Negro mass: drugs, alcohol, tobacco, not to speak of criminal pursuits. His personal life was impeccable, of a Puritanism unattainable for the mass. Human redemption. Malcolm had achieved it in his own lifetime, and this was known to the Negro community. In his television appearances and at public meetings, Malcolm articulated the woes and the aspirations of the depressed Negro mass in a way it was unable to do for itself. When he attacked the white man, Malcolm did for the Negroes what they couldn't do for themselves. He attacked with a violence and anger that spoke for the ages of misery. It was not an academic exercise of just giving hell to Mr. Charlie. Many of the Negro writers and artists who are national figures today revered Malcolm for what they considered his ruthless honesty in stating the Negro case, his refusal to compromise, and his search for a group identity that had been destroyed by the white man when he brought the Negroes in chains from Africa. The Negro writers and artists regarded Malcolm as the great catalyst, the man who inspired self-respect and devotion in the downtrodden millions. A group of these artists gathered one Sunday in my home, and we talked about Malcolm. Their devotion to him as a man was moving. One said, "Malcolm will never betray us. We have suffered too much from betrayals in the past." Malcolm's attitude toward the white man underwent a marked change in 1964, a change that contributed to his break with Elijah Muhammad and his racist doctrines. Malcolm's meteoric eruption on the national scene brought him into wider contact with white men who were not the devils he had thought they were. He was much in demand as a speaker at student forums in Eastern universities, and had appeared at many by the end of his short career as a national figure. He always spoke respectfully and with a certain surprise of the positive response of white students to his lectures. A second factor that contributed to his conversion to wider horizons was a growing doubt about the authenticity of Elijah Muhammad's version of the Muslim religion, a doubt that grew into a certainty with more knowledge and more experience. Certain secular practices at the Chicago headquarters of Elijah Muhammad had come to Malcolm's notice, and he was profoundly shocked. Finally, he embarked on a number of prolonged trips to Mecca and the newly independent African states through the good offices of the representatives of the Arab League in the United States. It was on his first trip to Mecca that he came to the conclusion that he had yet to discover Islam. Assassin's bullets ended Malcolm's career before he was able to develop this new approach, which in essence recognized the Negroes as an integral part of the American community, a far cry from Elijah Muhammad's doctrine of separation. Malcolm had reached the midpoint in redefining his attitude to this country and the white-black relationship. He no longer inveighed against the United States, but against a segment of the United States represented by overt white supremacists in the South and covert white supremacists in the North. It was Malcolm's intention to raise Negro militancy to a new high point with the main thrust aimed at both the southern and northern white supremacists. The Negro problem, which he had always said should be renamed the white man's problem, was beginning to assume new dimensions for him in the last months of his life. To the very end, Malcolm sought to refashion the broken strands between the American Negroes and African culture. He saw in this the road to a new sense of group identity, a self-conscious role in history, and above all, a sense of man's own worth, which he claimed the white man had destroyed in the Negro. American autobiographical literature is filled with numerous accounts of remarkable men who pulled themselves to the summit by their bootstraps. Few are as poignant as Malcolm's memoirs. As testimony to the power of redemption and the force of human personality, the Autobiography of Malcolm X is a revelation. New York, June 1965. The Autobiography of Malcolm X. Chapter 1. Nightmare. When my mother was pregnant with me, she told me later, a party of hooded Ku Klux Klan riders galloped up to our home in Omaha, Nebraska one night. Surrounding the house, brandishing their shotguns and rifles, they shouted for my father to come out. My mother went to the front door and opened it. Standing where they could see her pregnant condition, she told them that she was alone with her 3 small children and that my father was away preaching in Milwaukee. The Klansmen shouted threats and warnings at her that we better get out of town because the good Christian white people were not going to stand for my father's spreading trouble among the good Negroes of Omaha with the back to Africa preachings of Marcus Garvey. My father, the Reverend Earl Little, was a Baptist minister, a dedicated organizer for Marcus Aurelius Garvey's UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. With the help of such disciples as my father, Garvey, from his headquarters in New York City's Harlem, was raising the banner of black race purity and exhorting the Negro masses to return to their ancestral African homeland, a cause which had made Garvey the most controversial black man on earth. Still shouting threats, the Klansmen finally spurred their horses and galloped around the house, shattering every window pane with their gun butts. Then they rode off into the night, their torches flaring as suddenly as they had come. My father was enraged when he returned. He decided to wait until I was born, which would be soon, and then the family would move. I'm not sure why he made this decision, for he was not a frightened Negro, as most then were, and many still are today. My father was a big 6'4", very black man. He had only one eye. How he'd lost the other one I've never known. He was from Reynolds, Georgia, where he'd left school after the 3rd or maybe 4th grade. He believed, as did Marcus Garvey, that freedom, independence, and self-respect could never be achieved by the Negro in America, and that therefore the Negro should leave America to the white man and return to his African land of origin. Among the reasons my father decided to risk and dedicate his life to help disseminate this philosophy among his people was that he had seen 4 of his 6 brothers die by violence, 3 of them killed by white men, including 1 by lynching. What my father could not know then was that of the remaining 3, including himself, only 1, my Uncle Jim, would die in bed of natural causes. Northern white police were later to shoot my Uncle Oscar, and my father was finally himself to die by the white man's hands. It has always been my belief that I, too, will die by violence. I have done all that I can to be prepared. I was my father's 7th child. He had 3 children by a previous marriage, Ella, Earl, and Mary, who lived in Boston. He had met and married my mother in Philadelphia, where their first child, my oldest full brother, Wilfred, was born. They moved from Philadelphia to Omaha, where Hilda and then Filbert were born. I was next in line. My mother was 28 when I was born on May 19th, 1925, in an Omaha hospital. Then we moved to Milwaukee, where Reginald was born. From infancy, he had some kind of hernia condition which was to handicap him physically for the rest of his life. Louise Little, my mother, who was born in Grenada in the British West Indies, looked like a white woman. her father was white. She had straight black hair, and her accent did not sound like a Negro's. Of this white father of hers, I know nothing except her shame about it. I remember hearing her say she was glad that she'd never seen him. It was, of course, because of him that I got my reddish-brown, Marini color of skin and my hair of the same color. I was the lightest child in our family. Out in the world later on, in Boston and New York, I was among the millions of Negroes who were insane enough to feel that it was some kind of status symbol to be light-complexioned, that one was actually fortunate to be born thus. But still later, I learned to hate every drop of that white rapist's blood that is in me. Our family stayed only briefly in Milwaukee, for my father wanted to find a place where he could raise our own food and perhaps build a business. The teaching of Marcus Garvey stressed becoming independent of the white man. We went next, for some reason, to Lansing, Michigan. My father bought a house, and soon, as had been his pattern, he was doing freelance Christian preaching in local Negro Baptist churches, and during the week he was roaming about spreading word of Marcus Garvey. He'd begun to lay away savings for the store he'd always wanted to own when, as always, some stupid local Uncle Tom Negroes began to funnel stories about his revolutionary beliefs to the local white people. This time, the get-out-of-town threats came from a local hate society called the Black Legion. They wore black robes instead of white. Soon, nearly everywhere my father went, black legionnaires were reviling him as an uppity nigger, for wanting to own a store, for living outside the Lansing Negro district, for spreading unrest and dissension among the good niggers. As in Omaha, my mother was pregnant again, this time with my youngest sister. Shortly after Yvonne was born came the nightmare night in 1929, my earliest vivid memory. I remember being suddenly snatched awake into a frightening confusion of pistol shots and shouting and smoke and flames. My father had shouted and shot at the two white men who had set the fire and were running away. Our home was burning down around us. We were lunging and bumping and tumbling all over each other, trying to escape. My mother, with the baby in her arms, just made it into the yard before the house crashed in, showering sparks. I remember we were outside in the night in our underwear, crying and yelling our heads off. The white police and firemen came and stood around watching as the house burned down to the ground. My father prevailed on some friends to clothe and house us temporarily. Then he moved us into another house in the outskirts of East Lansing. In those days, Negroes weren't allowed after dark in East Lansing proper. There's where Michigan State University is located. I related all of this to an audience of students when I spoke there in January 1963, and had the first reunion in a long while with my younger brother, Robert, who was there doing postgraduate studies in psychology. I told them how East Lansing harassed us so much that we had to move again, this time 2 miles out of town into the country. This was where my father built for us with his own hands a 4-room house. This is where I really begin to remember things. This home where I started to grow up. After the fire, I remember that my father was called in and questioned about a permit for the pistol with which he had shot at the white men who set the fire. I remember that the police were always dropping by our house, shoving things around, just checking, or looking for a gun. The pistol they were looking for, which they never found, and for which they wouldn't issue a permit, was sewed up inside a pillow. My father's .22 rifle and his shotgun, though, were right out in the open. Everyone had them for hunting birds and rabbits and other game. After that, my memories are of the friction between my father and mother. They seemed to be nearly always at odds. Sometimes my father would beat her. It might have had something to do with the fact that my mother had a pretty good education. Where she got it, I don't know. But an educated woman, I suppose, can't resist the temptation to correct an uneducated man. Every now and then, when she put those smooth words on him, he would grab her. My father was also belligerent toward all of the children, except me. The older ones he would beat almost savagely if they broke any of his rules, and he had so many rules it was hard to know them all. Nearly all my whippings came from my mother. I've thought a lot about why. I actually believe that as anti-white as my father was, he was subconsciously so afflicted with the white man's brainwashing of Negroes that he inclined to favor the light ones, and I was his lightest child. Most Negro parents in those days would almost instinctively treat any lighter children better than they did the darker ones. It came directly from the slavery tradition that the mulatto, because he was visibly nearer to white, was therefore better. My two other images of my father are both outside the home. One was his role as a Baptist preacher. He never pastored in any regular church of his own. He was always a visiting preacher. I remember especially his favorite sermon, "That little black train is a-comin', and you better get all your business right." I guess this also fit his association with the Back to Africa movement, with Marcus Garvey's Black Train Homeward. My brother Philbert, the one just older than me, loved church, but it confused and amazed me. I would sit goggle-eyed at my father jumping and shouting as he preached, with the congregation jumping and shouting behind him, their souls and bodies devoted to singing and praying. Even at that young age, I just couldn't believe in the Christian concept of Jesus as someone divine, and no religious person, until I was a man in my 20s, and then in prison, could tell me anything. I had very little respect for most people who represented religion. It was in his role as a preacher that my father had most contact with the Negroes of Lansing. Believe me when I tell you that those Negroes were in bad shape then. They are still in bad shape, though in a different way. By that I mean that I don't know a town with a higher percentage of complacent and misguided so-called middle-class Negroes, the typical status symbol-oriented, integration-seeking type of Negroes. Just recently, I was standing in a lobby at the United Nations talking with an African ambassador and his wife, when a Negro came up to me and said, "You know me?" I was a little embarrassed because I thought he was someone I should remember. It turned out that he was one of those bragging, self-satisfied, middle-class Lansing Negroes. I wasn't ingratiated. He was the type who would never have been associated with Africa until the fad of having African friends became a status symbol for middle-class Negroes. Back when I was growing up, the successful Lansing Negroes were such as waiters and bootblacks. To be a janitor at some downtown store was to be highly respected. The real elite, the big shots, the voices of the race, were the waiters at the Lansing Country Club and the shoeshine boys at the state capitol. The only Negroes who really had any money were the ones in the numbers racket, or who ran the gambling houses, or who in some other way lived parasitically off the poorest ones, who were the masses. No Negroes were hired then by Lansing's big Oldsmobile plant, or the Rio plant. Do you remember the Rio? It was manufactured in Lansing, and R.E. Olds, the man after whom it was named, also lived in Lansing. When the war came along, they hired some Negro janitors. The bulk of the Negroes were either on welfare, or WPA, or they starved. The day was to come when our family was so poor that we would eat the whole out of a donut. But at that time we were much better off than most town Negroes. The reason was we raised much of our own food out there in the country where we were. We were much better off than the town Negroes who would shout, because my father preached, for the pie in the sky and their heaven in the hereafter, while the white man had his here on earth. I knew that the collections my father got for his preaching were mainly what fed and clothed us, and he also did other odd jobs. But still the image of him that made me proudest was his crusading and militant campaigning with the words of Marcus Garvey. As young as I was then, I knew from what I overheard that my father was saying something that made him a tough man. I remember an old lady grinning and saying to my father, "You're scaring these white folks to death." One of the reasons I've always felt that my father favored me was that, to the best of my remembrance, it was only me that he sometimes took with him to the Garvey UNIA meetings, which he held quietly in different people's homes. There were never more than a few people at any one time, 20 at most. But that was a lot, packed into someone's living room. I noticed how differently they all acted, although sometimes they were the same people who jumped and shouted in church. But in these meetings, both they and my father were more intense, more intelligent, and down to earth. It made me feel the same way. I can remember hearing of Adam driven out of the garden into the caves of Europe, Africa for the Africans, Ethiopians, awake. And my father would talk about how it would not be much longer before Africa would be completely run by Negroes. By black men was the phrase he always used. No one knows when the hour of Africa's redemption cometh. It is in the wind. It is coming. One day, like a storm, it will be here. I remember seeing the big, shiny photographs of Marcus Garvey that were passed from hand to hand. My father had a big envelope of them that he always took to these meetings. The picture showed what seemed to me millions of Negroes thronged in parade behind Garvey riding in a fine car, a big black man dressed in a dazzling uniform with gold braid on it, and he was wearing a thrilling hat with tall plumes. I remember hearing that he had black followers not only in the United States but all around the world. And I remember how the meetings always closed with my father saying several times, and the people chanting after him, "Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will." I've never understood why, after hearing as much as I did of these kinds of things, I somehow never thought then of the black people in Africa. My image of Africa at that time was of naked savages, cannibals, monkeys, and tigers and steaming jungles. My father would drive in his old black touring car, sometimes taking me, to meeting places all around the Lansing area. I remember one daytime meeting, most were at night, in the town of Owasso, 40 miles from Lansing, which the Negroes called White City. Owasso's greatest claim to fame is that it is the hometown of Thomas E. Dewey. As in East Lansing, no Negroes were allowed on the streets there after dark, hence the daytime meeting. In point of fact, in those days, lots of Michigan towns were like that. Every town had a few home Negroes who lived there. Sometimes it would be just one family, as in the nearby county seat, Mason, which had a single Negro family named Lyons. Mr. Lyons had been a famous football star at Mason High School, was highly thought of in Mason, and consequently he now worked around that town in menial jobs. My mother this time seemed to be always working, cooking, washing, ironing, cleaning, and fussing over us 8 children, and she was usually either arguing with or not speaking to my father. One cause of friction was that she had strong ideas about what she wouldn't eat and didn't want us to eat, including pork and rabbit, both of which my father loved dearly. He was a real Georgia Negro, and he believed in eating plenty of what we in Harlem today call soul food. I've said that my mother was the one who whipped me. At least she did whenever she wasn't ashamed to let the neighbors think she was killing me. For if she even acted as though she was about to raise her hand to me, I would open my mouth and let the world know about it. If anybody was passing by out on the road, she would either change her mind or just give me a few licks. Thinking about it now, I feel definitely that just as my father favored me for being lighter than the other children, my mother gave me more hell for the same reason. She was very light herself, but she favored the ones who were darker. Wilfred, I know, was particularly her angel. I remember that she would tell me to get out of the house and let the sun shine on you so you can get some color. She went out of her way never to let me become afflicted with a sense of color superiority. I'm sure that she treated me this way partly because of how she came to be light herself. I learned early that crying out in protest could accomplish things. My older brothers and sister had started to school when sometimes they would come in and ask for a buttered biscuit or something, and my mother impatiently would tell them no. But I would cry out and make a fuss until I got what I wanted. I remember well how my mother asked me why I couldn't be a nice boy like Wilfred, but I would think to myself that Wilfred, for being so nice and quiet, often stayed hungry. So early in life, I'd learned that if you want something, you'd better make some noise. Not only did we have our big garden, but we raised chickens. My father would buy some baby chicks, and my mother would raise them. We all loved chicken. That was one dish there was no argument with my father about. One thing in particular that I remember made me feel grateful toward my mother was that one day I went and asked her for my own garden, and she did let me have my own little plot. I loved it and took care of it well. I loved especially to grow peas. I was proud when we had them on our table. I would pull out the grass in my garden by hand when the first little blades came up. I would patrol the rows on my hands and knees for any worms and bugs, and I would kill and bury them. And sometimes when I had everything straight and clean for my things to grow, I would lie down on my back between two rows, and I would gaze up in the blue sky at the clouds moving and think all kinds of things. At 5, I too began to go to school, leaving home in the morning along with Wilfred, Hilda, and Filbert. It was the Pleasant Grove school that went from kindergarten through the 8th grade. It was 2 miles outside the city limits, and I guess there was no problem about our attending because we were the only Negroes in the area. In those days, white people in the North usually would adopt just a few Negroes. They didn't see them as any threat. The white kids didn't make any great thing about us either. They called us nigger and darky and rastas so much that we thought those were our natural names. But they didn't think of it as an insult. It was just the way they thought about us. One afternoon in 1931, when Wilfred, Hilda, Filbert, and I came home, my mother and father were having one of their arguments. There had lately been a lot of tension around the house because of Black Legion threats. Anyway, my father had taken one of the rabbits which we were raising and ordered my mother to cook it. We raised rabbits, but sold them to whites. My father had taken a rabbit from the rabbit pen. He had pulled off the rabbit's head. He was so strong he needed no knife to behead chickens or rabbits. With one twist of his big black hands, he simply twisted off the head and threw the bleeding neck thing back at my mother's feet. My mother was crying. She started to skin the rabbit, preparatory to cooking it. But my father was so angry he slammed on out the front door and started walking up the road toward town. It was then that my mother had this vision. She had always been a strange woman in this sense, and had always had a strong intuition of things about to happen. And most of her children are the same way, I think. When something is about to happen, I can feel something, sense something. I never have known something to happen that has caught me completely off guard, except once. And that was when, years later, I discovered facts I couldn't believe about a man who, up until that discovery, I would gladly have given my life for. My father was well up the road when my mother ran screaming out onto the porch. "Early! Early!" She screamed his name. She clutched up her apron in one hand and ran down across the yard and into the road. My father turned around. He saw her. For some reason, considering how angry he had been when he left, he waved at her, but he kept on going. She told me later, my mother did, that she had a vision of my father's end. All the rest of the afternoon she was not herself, crying and nervous and upset. She finished cooking the rabbit and put the whole thing in the warmer part of the black stove. When my father was not back home by our bedtime, my mother hugged and clutched us, and we felt strange, not knowing what to do, because she'd never acted like that. I remember waking up to the sound of my mother's screaming again. When I scrambled out, I saw the police in the living room. They were trying to calm her down. She had snatched on her clothes to go with them. And all of us children who were staring knew without anyone having to say it that something terrible had happened to our father. My mother was taken by the police to the hospital and to a room where a sheet was over my father in a bed, and she wouldn't look. She was afraid to look. Probably it was wise that she didn't. My father's skull on one side was crushed in, I was told later. Negroes in Lansing have always whispered that he was attacked and then laid across some tracks for a streetcar to run over him. His body was cut almost in half. He lived 2.5 hours in that condition. Negroes then were stronger than they are now, especially Georgia Negroes. Negroes born in Georgia had to be strong, simply to survive. It was morning when we children at home got the word that he was dead. I was 6. I can remember a vague commotion, the house filled up with people crying, saying bitterly that the white Black Legion had finally gotten him. My mother was hysterical. In the bedroom, women were holding smelling salts under her nose. She was still hysterical at the funeral. I don't have a very clear memory of the funeral either. Oddly, the main thing I remember is that it wasn't in a church, and that surprised me, since my father was a preacher, and I'd been where he preached people's funerals in churches. But his was in a funeral home. And I remember that during the service, a big black fly came down and landed on my father's face, and Wilfred sprang up from his chair and he shooed the fly away, and he came groping back to his chair. There were folding chairs for us to sit on, and the tears were streaming down his face. When we went by the casket, I remember that I thought that it looked as if my father's strong black face had been dusted with flour. and I wished they hadn't put on such a lot of it. Back in the big 4-room house, there were many visitors for another week or so. They were good friends of the family, such as the Lyons from Mason, 12 miles away, and the Walkers, McGuires, Liscoes, the Greens, Randolphs, and the Turners, and others from Lansing, and a lot of people from other towns whom I had seen at the Garvey meetings. We children adjusted more easily than our mother did. We couldn't see, as clearly as she did, the trials that lay ahead. As the visitors tapered off, she became very concerned about collecting the 2 insurance policies that my father had always been proud he carried. He had always said that families should be protected in case of death. One policy apparently paid off without any problem. The smaller one. I don't know the amount of it. I would imagine it was not more than $1,000, and maybe half of that. But after that money came, and my mother had paid out a lot of it for the funeral and expenses, she began going into town and returning very upset. The company that had issued the bigger policy was balking at paying off. They were claiming that my father had committed suicide. Visitors came again, and there was bitter talk about white people. How could my father bash himself in the head, then get down across the streetcar tracks to be run over? So there we were. My mother was 34 years old now, with no husband, no provider or protector to take care of her 8 children. But some kind of a family routine got going again. And for as long as the first insurance money lasted, we did all right. Wilfred, who was a pretty stable fellow, began to act older than his age. I think he had the sense to see, when the rest of us didn't, what was in the wind for us. He quietly quit school and went to town in search of work. He took any kind of job he could find, and he would come home dog-tired in the evenings and give whatever he had made to my mother. Hilda always had been quiet, too, attended to the babies. Filbert and I didn't contribute anything. We just fought all the time. Each other at home, and then at school we would team up and fight white kids. Sometimes the fights would be racial in nature, but they might be about anything. Reginald came under my wing. Since he'd grown out of the toddling stage, he and I had become very close. I suppose I enjoyed the fact that he was the little one, under me, who looked up to me. My mother began to buy on credit. My father had always been very strongly against credit. Credit is the first step into debt and back into slavery, he had always said. And then she went to work herself. She would go into Lansing and find different jobs, in housework or sewing, for white people. They didn't realize, usually, that she was a Negro. A lot of white people around there didn't want Negroes in their houses. She would do fine until in some way or other it got to people who she was, whose widow she was. And then she would be let go. I remember how she used to come home crying, but trying to hide it, because she had lost a job that she needed so much. Once when one of us, I cannot remember which, had to go for something to where she was working, and the people saw us and realized she was actually a Negro, she was fired on the spot, and she came home crying, this time not hiding it. When the state welfare people began coming to our house, we would come from school sometimes and find them talking with our mother, asking 1,000 questions. They acted and looked at her and at us and around in our house in a way that had about it the feeling, at least for me, that we were not people. In their eyesight, we were just things. That was all. My mother began to receive 2 checks, a welfare check and, I believe, a widow's pension. The checks helped, but they weren't enough, as many of us as there were. When they came, about the first of the month, one always was already owed in full, if not more, to the man at the grocery store, and after that the other one didn't last long. We began to go swiftly downhill. The physical downhill wasn't as quick as the psychological. My mother was, above everything else, a proud woman, and it took its toll on her that she was accepting charity, and her feelings were communicated to us. She would speak sharply to the man at the grocery store for padding the bill, telling him that she wasn't ignorant, and he didn't like that. She would talk back sharply to the state welfare people, telling them that she was a grown woman, able to raise her children, that it wasn't necessary for them to keep coming around so much, meddling in our lives. And they didn't like that. But the monthly welfare check was their pass. They acted as if they owned us, as if we were their private property. As much as my mother would have liked to, she couldn't keep them out. She would get particularly incensed when they began insisting upon drawing us older children aside, one at a time, out on the porch or somewhere, and asking us questions or telling us things. Against our mother, and against each other. We couldn't understand why, if the state was willing to give us packages of meat, sacks of potatoes and fruit, and cans of all kinds of things, our mother obviously hated to accept. We really couldn't understand. What I later understood was that my mother was making a desperate effort to preserve her pride, and ours. Pride was just about all we had to preserve, for by 1934 we really began to suffer. This was about the worst Depression year, and no one we knew had enough to eat or live on. Some old family friends visited us now and then. At first they brought food. Though it was charity, my mother took it. Wilfred was working to help. My mother was working when she could find any kind of job. In Lansing there was a bakery where for a nickel a couple of us children would buy a tall flour sack of day-old bread and cookies and then walk the 2 miles back out into the country to our house. Our mother knew, I guess, dozens of ways to cook things with bread and out of bread. Stewed tomatoes with bread. Maybe that would be a meal. Something like French toast, if we had any eggs. Bread pudding, sometimes with raisins in it. If we got hold of some hamburger, it came to the table more bread than meat. The cookies that were always in the sack with the bread, we just gobbled down straight. But there were times when there wasn't even a nickel, and we would be so hungry we were dizzy. My mother would boil a big pot of dandelion greens, and we would eat that. I remember that some small-minded neighbor put it out, and children would tease us, that we ate fried grass. Sometimes, if we were lucky, we would have oatmeal or cornmeal mush 3 times a day, or mush in the morning and cornbread at night. Filbert and I were grown up enough to quit fighting long enough to take the .22 caliber rifle that had been our father's and shoot rabbits that some white neighbors up or down the road would buy. I know now that they just did it to help us, because they, like everyone, shot their own rabbits. Sometimes I remember Filbert and I would take little Reginald along with us. He wasn't very strong, but he was always so proud to be along. We would trap muskrats out in a little creek in back of our house, and we would lie quiet until unsuspecting bullfrogs appeared, and we would spear them, cut off their legs, and sell them for a nickel a pair to people who lived up and down the road. The whites seemed less restricted in their dietary tastes. Then about in late 1934, I would guess, something began to happen. Some kind of psychological deterioration hit our family circle and began to eat away our pride. Perhaps it was the constant, tangible evidence that we were destitute. We had known other families who'd gone on relief. We had known, without anyone in our home ever expressing it, that we'd felt prouder not to be at the depot where the free food was passed out. And now, we were among them. At school, the on relief finger suddenly was pointed at us too, and sometimes it was said aloud. It seemed that everything to eat in our house was stamped, "Not to be sold." All welfare food bore this stamp to keep the recipients from selling it. It's a wonder we didn't come to think of "not to be sold" as a brand name. Sometimes, instead of going home from school, I walked the 2 miles up the road into Lansing. I began drifting from store to store, hanging around outside where things like apples were displayed in boxes and barrels and baskets, and I would watch my chance and steal me a treat. You know what a treat was to me? Anything. Or I began to drop in about dinner time at the home of some family that we knew. I knew that they knew exactly why I was there, but they never embarrassed me by letting on. They would invite me to stay for supper, and I would stuff myself. Especially I liked to drop in and visit at the Gohanna's home. They were nice, older people and great churchgoers. I'd watched them lead the jumping and shouting when my father preached. They had, living with them, they were raising him, a nephew whom everyone called Big Boy, and he and I got along fine. Also living with the Gohannas was old Mrs. Adcock, who went with them to church. She was always trying to help anybody she could, visiting anyone she heard was sick, carrying them something. She was the one who years later would tell me something that I remembered a long time. "Malcolm, there's one thing I like about you. You're no good, but you don't try to hide it. You are not a hypocrite." The more I began to stay away from home and visit people and steal from the stores, the more aggressive I became in my inclinations. I never wanted to wait for anything. I was growing up fast, physically more so than mentally. As I began to be recognized more around the town, I started to become aware of the peculiar attitude of white people toward me. I sensed that it had to do with my father. It was an adult version of what several white children had said at school, in hints, or sometimes in the open, which really expressed what their parents had said, that the Black Legion or the Klan had killed my father, and the insurance company pulled a fast one in refusing to pay my mother the policy money. When I began to get caught stealing now and then, the state welfare people began to focus on me when they came to our house. I can't remember how I first became aware that they were talking of taking me away. What I first remember along that line was my mother raising a storm about being able to bring up her own children. She would whip me for stealing, and I would try to alarm the neighborhood with my yelling. One thing I've always been proud of is that I never raised my hand against my mother. In the summertime at night, in addition to all the other things we did, some of us boys would slip out down the road or across the pastures and go cooning watermelons. White people always associated watermelons with Negroes, and they sometimes called Negroes coons among all the other names, and so stealing watermelons became cooning them. If white boys were doing it, it implied that they were only acting like Negroes. Whites have always hidden or justified all of the guilts they could by ridiculing or blaming Negroes. One Halloween night, I remember that a bunch of us were out tipping over those old country outhouses, and one old farmer, I guess he had tipped over enough in his day, had set a trap for us. Always, you sneak up from behind the outhouse, then you gang together and push it to tip it over. This farmer had taken his outhouse off the hole and set it just in front of the hole. Well, we came sneaking up in single file in the darkness, and the two white boys in the lead fell down into the outhouse hole neck deep. They smelled so bad it was all we could stand to get them out, and that finished us all for that Halloween. I just missed falling in myself. The whites were so used to taking the lead, this time it had really gotten them in the hole. Thus, in various ways, I learned various things. I picked strawberries, and though I can't recall what I got per crate for picking, I remember that after working hard all one day, I wound up with about $1, which was a whole lot of money in those times. I was so hungry I didn't know what to do. I was walking away toward town with visions of buying something good to eat, and this older white boy I knew, Richard Dixon, came up and asked me if I wanted to match nickels. He had plenty of change for my $1. In about a half hour, he had all the change back, including my $1, and instead of going to town to buy something, I went home with nothing, and I was bitter. But that was nothing compared to what I felt when I found out later that he had cheated. There's a way that you can catch and hold the nickel and make it come up the way you want. This was my first lesson about gambling. If you see somebody winning all the time, he isn't gambling, he's cheating. Later on in life, if I were continuously losing in any gambling situation, I would watch very closely. It's like the Negro in America seeing the white man win all the time. He's a professional gambler. He has all the cards and the odds stacked on his side, and he has always dealt to our people from the bottom of the deck. About this time, my mother began to be visited by some Seventh-day Adventists who had moved into a house not too far down the road from us. They would talk to her for hours at a time and leave booklets and leaflets and magazines for her to read. She read them, and Wilfred, who had started back to school after we'd begun to get the relief food supplies, also read a lot. His head was forever in some book. Before long, my mother spent much time with the Adventists. It's my belief that what mostly influenced her was that they had even more diet restrictions than she always had taught and practiced with us. Like us, they were against eating rabbit and pork. They followed the Mosaic dietary laws. They ate nothing of the flesh without a split hoof, or that didn't chew a cud. We began to go with my mother to the Adventist meetings that were held further out in the country. For us children, I know that the major attraction was the good food they served. But we listened, too. There were a handful of Negroes from small towns in the area, but I would say that it was 99% white people. The Adventists felt that we were living at the end of time, that the world soon was coming to an end. But they were the friendliest white people I had ever seen. In some ways, though, we children noticed, and when we were back at home discussed, that they were different from us, such as the lack of enough seasoning in their food, and the different way that white people smelled. Meanwhile, the state welfare people kept after my mother. By now she didn't make it any secret that she hated them, and didn't want them in her house, but they exerted their right to come, and I have many, many times reflected upon how talking to us children, they began to plant the seeds of division in our minds. They would ask such things as who was smarter than the other, and they would ask me why I was so different. I think they felt that getting children into foster homes was a legitimate part of their function, and the result would be less troublesome, however they went about it. And when my mother fought them, they went after her. First through me. I was the first target. I stole. That implied that I wasn't being taken care of by my mother. All of us were mischievous at some time or another, I more so than any of the rest. Filbert and I kept a battle going, and this was just one of a dozen things that kept building up the pressure on my mother. I'm not sure just how or when the idea was first dropped by the welfare workers that our mother was losing her mind, but I can distinctly remember hearing crazy applied to her by them when they learned that the Negro farmer who was in the next house down the road from us had offered to give us some butchered pork, a whole pig, maybe even 2 of them, and she had refused. We all heard them call my mother crazy to her face for refusing good meat. It meant nothing to them even when she explained that we'd never eaten pork, that it was against her religion as a Seventh-day Adventist. They were as vicious as vultures. They had no feelings, understanding, compassion, or respect for my mother. They told us she's crazy for refusing food. Right then was when our home, our unity, began to disintegrate. We were having a hard time, and I wasn't helping. But we could have made it. We could have stayed together. As bad as I was, as much trouble and worry as I caused my mother, I loved her. The state people, we found out, had interviewed the Gohanus family, and the Gohanus had said they would take me into their home. My mother threw a fit, though, when she heard that, and the home wreckers took cover for a while. It was about this time that the large, dark man from Lansing began visiting. I don't remember how or where he and my mother met. It may have been through some mutual friends. I don't remember what the man's profession was. In 1935, in Lansing, Negroes didn't have anything you could call a profession. But the man, big and black, looked something like my father. I can remember his name, but there's no need to mention it. He was a single man, and my mother was a widow, only 36 years old. The man was independent. Naturally, she admired that. She was having a hard time disciplining us, and a big man's presence alone would help. And if she had a man to provide, it would send the state people away forever. We all understood without ever saying much about it, or at least we had no objection. We took it in stride, even with some amusement among us, that when the man came, our mother would be all dressed up in the best that she had. She still was a good-looking woman, and she would act differently, light-hearted and laughing, as we hadn't seen her act in years. It went on for about a year, I guess, and then about 1936 or 1937, the man from Lansing jilted my mother suddenly. He just stopped coming to see her. From what I later understood, he finally backed away from taking on the responsibility of those 8 mouths to feed. He was afraid of so many of us. To this day, I can see the trap that Mother was in, saddled with all of us, and I can also understand why he would shun taking on such a tremendous responsibility. But it was a terrible shock to her. It was the beginning of the end of reality for my mother. When she began to sit around and walk around talking to herself, almost as though she was unaware that we were there, it became increasingly terrifying. The state people saw a weakening. That was when they began the definite steps to take me away from home. They began to tell me how nice it was going to be at the Gohanus home, where the Gohanus and Big Boy and Mrs. Adcock had all said how much they liked me and would like to have me live with them. I liked all of them too, but I didn't want to leave Wilfred. I looked up to and admired my big brother. I didn't want to leave Hilda, who was like my second mother, or Filbert. Even in our fighting, there was a feeling of brotherly union. Or Reginald, especially, who was weak with his hernia condition, and who looked up to me as his big brother who looked out for him, as I looked up to Wilfred. And I had nothing either against the babies, Yvonne, Wesley, and Robert. As my mother talked to herself more and more, she gradually became less responsive to us, and less responsible. The house became less tidy. We began to be more unkempt, and usually now Hilda cooked. We children watched our anchor giving way. It was something terrible that you couldn't get your hands on, yet you couldn't get away from. It was a sensing that something bad was going to happen. We younger ones leaned more and more heavily on the relative strength of Wilfred and Hilda, who were the oldest. When finally I was sent to the Gahanna's home, at least in a surface way, I was glad. I remember that when I left home with the state man, my mother said one thing: "Don't let them feed him any pig." It was better in a lot of ways at the Gahanna's. Big Boy and I shared his room together, and we hit it off nicely. He just wasn't the same as my blood brothers. The Gahanna's were very religious people. Big Boy and I attended church with them. They were sanctified holy rollers now. The preachers and congregations jumped even higher and shouted even louder than the Baptists I had known. They sang at the top of their lungs and swayed back and forth and cried and moaned and beat on tambourines and chanted. It was spooky, with ghosts and spirituals and hats seeming to be in the very atmosphere, when finally we all came out of the church, going back home. The Gahanna's and Mrs. Adcock loved to go fishing, and some Saturdays Big Boy and I would go along. I had changed schools now to Lansing's West Junior High School. It was right in the heart of the Negro community, and a few white kids were there, but Big Boy didn't mix much with any of our schoolmates, and I didn't either. And when we went fishing, neither he nor I liked the idea of just sitting and waiting for the fish to jerk the cork under the water, or make the tight line quiver when we fished that way. I figured there should be some smarter way to get the fish, though we never discovered what it might be. Mr. Gahanna's was close cronies with some other men who, some Saturdays, would take me and Big Boy with them hunting rabbits. I had my father's .22 caliber rifle. My mother had said it was all right for me to take it with me. The old men had a set rabbit hunting strategy that they had always used. Usually when a dog jumps a rabbit and the rabbit gets away, that rabbit will always somehow instinctively run in a circle and return sooner or later past the very spot where he originally was jumped. Well, the old men would just sit and wait in hiding somewhere for the rabbit to come back, then get their shots at him. I got to thinking about it, and finally I thought of a plan. I would separate from them, and Big Boy and I would go to a point where I figured that the rabbit, returning, would have to pass me first. It worked like magic. I began to get 3 and 4 rabbits before they got one. The astonishing thing was that none of the old men ever figured out why. They outdid themselves, exclaiming what a sure shot I was. I was about 12 then. All I had done was to improve on their strategy. And it was the beginning of a very important lesson in life, that any time you find someone more successful than you are, especially when you're both engaged in the same business, you know they're doing something that you aren't. I would return home to visit fairly often. Sometimes Big Boy and one or another or both of the Gahanna's would go with me, sometimes not. I would be glad when some of them did go because it made the ordeal easier. Soon the state people were making plans to take over all of my mother's children. She talked to herself nearly all of the time now, and there was a crowd of new white people entering the picture, always asking questions. They would even visit me at the Gahanna's. They would ask me questions out on the porch or sitting out in their cars. Eventually, my mother suffered a complete breakdown, and the court orders were finally signed. They took her to the state mental hospital at Kalamazoo. It was 70-some miles from Lansing, about an hour and a half on the bus. A Judge McClellan in Lansing had authority over me and all of my brothers and sisters. We were state children, court wards. He had the full say-so over us. A white man in charge of a black man's children. Nothing but legal, modern slavery, however kindly intentioned. My mother remained in the same hospital at Kalamazoo for about 26 years. Later, when I was still growing up in Michigan, I would go to visit her every so often. Nothing that I can imagine could have moved me as deeply as seeing her pitiful state. In 1963, we got my mother out of the hospital, and she now lives there in Lansing with Philbert and his family. It was so much worse than if it had been a physical sickness, for which a cause might be known, medicine given, a cure effected. Every time I visited her, when finally they led her, a case, a number, back inside from where we'd been sitting together, I felt worse. My last visit, when I knew I would never come to see her again, there, was in 1952. I was 27. My brother Philbert had told me that on his last visit, she had recognized him somewhat. In spots, he said. But she didn't recognize me at all. She stared at me. She didn't know who I was. Her mind, when I tried to talk, to reach her was somewhere else. I asked, "Mama, do you know what day it is?" She said, staring, "All the people have gone." I can't describe how I felt. The woman who had brought me into the world and nursed me and advised me and chastised me and loved me didn't know me. It was as if I was trying to walk up the side of a hill of feathers. I looked at her. I listened to her talk, but there was nothing I could do. I truly believe that if ever a state social agency destroyed a family, it destroyed ours. We wanted and tried to stay together. Our home didn't have to be destroyed, but the welfare, the courts, and their doctor gave us the 1-2-3 punch, and ours was not the only case of this kind. I knew I wouldn't be back to see my mother again because it could make me a very vicious and dangerous person. Knowing how they had looked at us as numbers and as a case in their book, not as human beings, and knowing that my mother in there was a statistic that didn't have to be, that existed because of a society's failure, hypocrisy, greed, and lack of mercy and compassion. Hence, I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. I rarely talk to anyone about my mother, for I believe that I'm capable of killing a person without hesitation or happen to make the wrong kind of remark about my mother. So I purposely don't make any opening for some fool to step into. Back then, when our family was destroyed in 1937, Wilfred and Hilda were old enough so that the state let them stay on their own in the big 4-room house that my father had built. Filbert was placed with another family in Lansing, a Mrs. Hackett, while Reginald and Wesley went to live with a family called Williams, who were friends of my mother's. And Yvonne and Robert went to live with a West Indian family named McGuire. Separated though we were, all of us maintained fairly close touch around Lansing, in school and out, whenever we could get together. Despite the artificially created separation and distance between us, we still remained very close in our feelings toward each other.
Context of white supremacy. We will be picking back up on chapter 2. Where we're picking back up. I do have the PDF, not the actual physical book, so I can't help you out with page numbers at all, but shouldn't be that difficult. Just flip to chapter 2. That's what we will pick up at for audio segment number 2. That's it. Folks who would like to participate, the number to dial is 760-569-7676. The code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. If you do not want to use your phone to dial in, you can use the free Flash phone. It's linked at Black Talk Radio Network. The address to access it is tiny, TINY.cc/1 race, and that is the number 1. That address again is tiny, TINY.cc/1 race, and that is the number 1. When you put that URL in, click the link on the left side of the page. It says free Flash phone. When you click it, it will open a small window on your screen. The first line, it is a drop down menu. Select the number that I just gave out, which again is 760-569-7676. The next line, it will ask for the code. That code again is 564943. The final line, it will ask for a name. Put in a nickname, press random keys, your real name if you're comfortable with that. Once you get that information entered, click the green button at the bottom. It will connect you to the live program. You should be able to hear us. It is the same procedure. If you want to participate, you will see the dial pad on your screen. Press *6. When you do so, you will hear the audio prompt. Press the number 1. We will get you on the line. That being said, there are many books that have been written about Minister Malcolm X. Some of the other biographies that I've read that might be good to supplement if you are interested. From the dead level, Hakeem Jamal, The Death and Life of Malcolm X, Peter Goldman, who is a suspected race soldier, The Judas Factor, Carl Evans, kind of gives more information about the COINTELPRO program. It gives information about some of the reasons that powerful racists wanted Malcolm X to be dead. A lot of great extra information. Plus, there are tons of others. Great documentaries. PBS even did a great documentary. Make It Plain. Sonia Sanchez is in it. Ozzie Davis is in it. John Henrik Clark is in it. It is masterful. It's about 2.5 hours. Anywho, folks would like to share a thought. We will get to the folks that dialed in. I guess I'll make my request. The people that dial in to participate, if you could just share whether or not you have read the book before, that would be good. And then whatever comments you want to chime in with. But everyone who dialed in with a hand up, your line should be open. Feel free to chime in.
Greetings. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, I've read the book before. I like Malcolm X, looked up to my older brother. He's only a year older, and he was always reading. And when he put down a book, I would probably pick it up and start reading it. I didn't know anything about, Malcolm X at all. And I started reading this, and this is like a real adventure story. As I was reading the book, and even reading through it the first time, it really didn't grasp me on exactly on what it was about. But the second time around, the book really was responsible for introducing me to being serious about the system of racism and white supremacy. And I'm pretty sure a lot of other people would say the same thing too about it. But yeah, and so very significant book, and I'm glad that this is one of the books that is being read, and I'll let someone else take part.
You're a little low. Yes, we can hear you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
That's better. Yes, sir.
Okay. I have read this book. I actually read this book right after Katrina. I was in Baton Rouge and to evacuate from the storm. And I read this book because the previous senior class at the time read this book as required reading for the summer reading, and I decided to read this book as well. And listening to this audiobook, I picked up one of the things that the author mentioned about the food items being tagged as not to be sold. I didn't realize that could be a racist tactic on the part of white people to prevent black people from selling different types of food items, because I've seen that before, and I've seen that in in stores. So I didn't realize that was something that was so old, and it could be some sort of racist act. But just wanted to share that.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, Gus. Greetings to other callers, listeners. I have to say that I have read the book before, but it was so long ago that it's almost like I'm reading it again for the first time. I must say I believe that was either the introduction that was written by the racist suspect, M.S. Handler, suspicious of some of the comments that he made. And I think Minister Malcolm had confidence in him, but I don't know how far you can trust some of these refined practitioners of racism, white supremacy. But moving along, I think noteworthy that the KKK burned his family's home. The one they were living in, I believe it was Nebraska, the first home, and they also burned the second home that they were living in Lansing, Michigan. They burned the home down, and then the police come looking for the gun that Mr. Earl Little used to shoot at the arsonist. Now, Earl Little, Malcolm's father, was a Marcus Garvey and a preacher, and probably no-nonsense type fellow, where he probably carried the Bible, but also carried a pistol. And he wasn't afraid to use it. So there was some mystery behind how Mr. Earl Little met his demise. Reported in the newspapers that it was an accident, but there were eyewitness reports that he was pushed underneath the streetcar. I believe an 8-year-old boy gave account to that. The insurance companies did not want to pay. There was 2 life insurance policies. They didn't want it. One did not pay. One did pay about $1,000, and you can imagine all the debt that was accumulated from fuel expenses and the care for 8 kids, or 10. I think it was 10 altogether. He was the 8th. And Malcolm was the lightest of his children, and he had some favor in his father's eyes. He brought him along to the UNIA meetings with Marcus Garvey, and that probably had a great influence on his thinking. And thumbs up for Mr. Earl Little for teaching his children about racism, or at least Malcolm. He showed some favoritism because of his lighter skin color, but that was probably a practice that was pretty prevalent during that time. I thought it was interesting that his mother had a white parent, and that the only Negroes that had money, I guess we're talking about like 1930, were the ones that was in the number rackets, who ran the gambling houses, and who lived parasitically off of the poor ones. And I think that to a large degree that same thing is going on today. I thought it was interesting blacks were not allowed on the street after dark, sort of color curfew, if you will. He learned early that crying out in protest could accomplish things. With the biscuit episode, if he raised a fuss, sort of like the squeaking wheel gets the grease, so to speak. And different lessons that he learned during his lifetime served him later on. One of the insurance companies said he committed suicide. I don't know how you could come to that conclusion when his body was almost severed in half by a streetcar. Why would anybody? I don't know. I just won't even comment on that. But as a pattern, the white people use when you get things on credit, the grocery bills, you go in, you got a tab, they'll pad that bill for you. You know, say you got $50 worth, they go ahead and put 90, 100, some black tax if they put on all blacks, the welfare check, the people subject to family to humiliation, destroyed the mother's pride, and with the pressure of 10 kids and husband's death and no money, you know, it contributed to her mental breakdown. And I thought it was interesting that they mentioned that whites have all the cards stacked already against blacks, and they deal from the bottom of the deck. I'll mute my line. Thanks for taking the call, Gus.
Everybody else who has a hand up, who has not shared yet, your line should be open.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
You can hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, great. Talk about the institution of racism, Gus. I tell you, if I haven't been listening to your program, and, you know, and the open definition you gave about racism every time you present your program, I would never have been able to identify things that I do now. And one of the things, I think the demise started at that family when she was, you know, racism, it caused the insurance company to flip the script on her. You know, I mean, the fact that they pulled that money for her knowing that she had 8 kids, you know, that was really demise. I think if she had had the finances worthwhile, she was a very strong woman, she really had made it. So to me, it wasn't so much a Blair thing. I think it was much of the demise started when that money did not come when it should be. So I'm really enjoying this. I've never read the book before, so I'm truly elated, and I'm going to listen to every program. This is truly a lesson, and I thank you.
Appreciate that. All the other folks who have a hand up, you should be with us.
Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thanks. Greetings to you and all the other callers and listeners. I have read this book before, and actually I've read it within the past year, probably a little less than a year. A few things I wanted to point out was, I guess, like going off of what the previous caller was saying, how you really see your definition of racism, white supremacy, and the treatment of his family before, after his father's death, in particular with his mother. I think that overall she was probably a little less confused about the system they lived in as far as the actual workings of it. The particular part was when the welfare people first started coming, and she said, you know, I'm a grown woman, I can raise my children. I think that speaks to her understanding of how they, by them interfering in her family, they wanted to keep her and her family in an infantile state and dependent upon them. And she understood that would be their undoing. And sure enough, it was. You see definite mistreatment of her family by the welfare people, and even the most tacky manner of trying to cause disruption with the children, trying to pit them against one another. It's overall, it's just very, very, very tacky in the way they treated them. And again, yeah, I'm thankful for this program as well, because when I read this, I didn't necessarily pick that out as terrorism. It was just a sad story. But now I'm able to see exactly how the system affected his family overall. To talk a little bit more about maybe his father, one of the passages on my book at page 84, he was like, one of the reasons I've always felt that my father favored me was that, to the best of my remembrance, it was only me that he sometimes took with him to the Garvey UNIA meetings. I found that interesting because I feel like his father might have understood that his lighter skin would give him access to, I guess, more positive treatment because of how his father obviously treated him as well. He said his father treated him, he thinks, because he was lighter skin, he treated him a lot better. And I think his father also felt like it was important for his son to be exposed to that, because his lighter skin would afford him the ability to be able to speak to others. That might just be my own inference, but I like to think of it that way. And the last thing I wanted to speak on was the part right after that on page 85 where his father is talking about how Africa would be run by black men, and I immediately thought of how, we're always saying white people are not ignorant of anything. They read more on us than anyone does, and a thought that passed my mind was, I wonder if they might have read this book when it first came out and was like, we should maybe implement a lot of heads of state in Africa as black men to make them think that Africa is run by black people. And I just found that kind of foreboding, I guess. But yeah, I'm very thankful that you picked this book, and I think the timing is very great as well. So I will keep on listening.
Appreciate that. Anybody we haven't heard from who had a hand up?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Hotep, everybody. This is definitely a great book. I think the timing also is very good. Just to share some thoughts, there's quite a lot, I think, that could be said about what's already been read and mentioned. But particularly, I found it really interesting the fact that when his family moved to the new town, that it was a group of black people that kind of sold them out. It made me think about when he mentioned the Ku Klux Klan that wore black, and what it reminded me of was a story that I read about a man named William Pierce from a book called The Underground Railroad, about an unsung hero really in that movement. I know people talk a lot about Harriet Tubman, but a man by the name of William Still was also instrumental in liberating a lot of our people to the degree that they were liberated, no longer in chattel slavery and so forth. There was a story I read about this man named William Pierce, and in his story, he was on a plantation with a master and a mistress. He describes the mistress as being more wicked and devilish than the master, in that the slaves that she was responsible for seeing over were hardly ever fed, and then just generally speaking, they were only fed like things like cornbread. So he describes in his story how one night they managed to get a chicken, and in the cloak of dark they prepare this chicken and they eat this chicken, and there was this one slave who, ate some of the chicken, but by the morning, they had been ratted out. He had gone back to the master and the mistress and told them that the slaves got the chicken and went about their business doing this behind their back, and the slaves ended up being beaten. And this man in particular, William Pierce, he was beaten so bad that he was like out of commission for like 3 weeks. So his story ends up with him saying that he would rather go to Canada for years in the cold rather than ever seek any kind of help or aid from these white people. And the reason why I mention this, again, there's a lot of points that could be said about this story, but this kind of reminds me of how important it is for us to be mindful. Be mindful of white people, yes. Be mindful of those within our ranks that can do us harm. Sometimes it ends up being that way. Their minds are co-opted and they've just signed on to the system of white supremacy full force. And at times they're doing things because they don't know any better. No excuse. But the reality is that these things do happen. And they have serious effects, one of which, the death of Malcolm, the death of his father. There's some, I think, culpability there on our part. And for that, I think we should, which most of us are already doing, continue to look out for one another. Continue to know who the real enemy is. And as you say oftentimes in your prayer, be patient with each other. And really make that sense of unity a real thing, not something that's just in words. And it's just one's own personal vow and conviction to never find themselves on that side of the fence where they're working against their own self-interest, as we have seen evidence of. And that's all I wanted to share at this time.
Appreciate that. Anybody else with us that has not shared yet that had a hand up?
Yes, this is Scotty. Greetings, Gus. Greetings to all the listeners. I love this book. I first read this book in 1991 while I was doing a tour of duty in Saudi Arabia. And it kind of held special meaning for me because I imagine Malcolm walking down the same streets that I walked down when I was in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. That's where he went on for Mecca. So, I'm not going to say that it put me on a path of militancy. I think my mom put me on the path to militancy at a very young age and making me stand up to bullies and not run home to my mother crying, but make me stand up to them and fight. Some of the notes that I took as I was listening to this, and I haven't read the book since I first read it, so I appreciate you picking this book. Make sure that I don't miss an episode. If for some reason I do, I can always go to the archives. But I did not recall the part where he talked about being a ward of the state being legalized slavery. I do a lot of work around legalized slavery and modern slavery. I never heard Malcolm speak on it in terms of the 13th Amendment, but he recognized at that young age that these white people are over us. They are in direct control of us, of a black man's children, and it's legalized slavery. Now, of course, they're not in greater confinement. They were not in greater confinement as being on a prison plantation, and they weren't being made to work like the vast majority of the prisoners do. So I'm just wondering if he had lived and still been with us today. I have no doubt that he would see slavery as I see it today as never being abolished. Another thing that stood out to me was city people having it harder during that time of famine, during the Depression. And these country folk could hunt and feed themselves that way, grow food as well. I see that today. I have heard that there's a migration of black people coming back to the South or moving to the country. And certainly, I am comforted by the fact that if we can't ever afford food, well, we do. Mostly all of my relatives have gardens. And, of course, we can hunt deer and things of that nature. So, I see that as being a problem today with your food deserts and stuff in urban areas. And I just don't feel like that's a good place for black people to be, especially with, their huge slave patrols gunning down people and capturing them for legalized slavery. Whenever I read or listen to some of the lectures or interviews of people from time periods past, I always try to identify if we're still being plagued with those problems today. In terms of black unity, we're still dealing with the light skin versus dark skin. That's still being promoted. Unfortunately, is even being promoted by black people. This whole light skin versus dark skin, that just shows how we've been affected. Some of us have been affected with the white supremacy virus, that we would view those who are not as melanated as being somehow superior, or that they're getting advantages. That may be true to some extent, but I don't know how you can judge somebody based on, who their parents are or who their ancestors are that resulted in them being less melanated. But I see that as still being a dividing factor in the black community, this whole light skin versus dark skin. They made several documentaries about that here recently, so that, to me, that's still a problem. Middle-class black people versus poor blacks that he talked about. Again, this is self-reflection as a people. I feel like we still plagued by this problem, that we tend to look down on people who are not as quote-unquote educated, meaning a formal education. We look down on those who probably don't speak as well, who don't use good English diction, who may have accents or whatnot. I think that that's still a problem when we look at Bill Cosby's pound cake speech, when we look at what Oprah said about the protesters in the street, those derogatory comments. I still feel like that's a problem that has to be solved among ourselves, is more unity and stop this middle class, upper class versus poor people. Malcolm even himself later would say that about being patient with each other is don't judge somebody because they don't think like you think as quick as you think, or know as much as you know, because at one time you didn't know what you know now. And so, we must be patient. That was brought up by the previous caller. But I do see that as an internal problem that needs to be worked on, this whole classism among black people, and looking down on those who don't have as much material things as we may have, who education level may not be as, what ours may be, and, that's incorrect. Another thing, my mom always said this. She said that one thing about Martin Luther King is that when he gave that one of his final speeches, how he spoke about his own death. and saying, I won't get there to the other side with you. Now, my mom's a very spiritual person. I'm a spiritual person, too. I just don't wear it on my sleeve. And I do believe in certain spiritual principles about speaking things into existence. And she felt like, Malcolm, that MLK should have never said that, I'm going to die in the affirmative or affirming. I mean, you could recognize that what you engaged in is dangerous and that your life is on the line, but when you speak those words as a matter of fact, that will come true. And, Malcolm said as a young child, as I was listening again to that clip, talked about he was going to die a violent death, just like his father. So I just think we need to watch our words and what we confirm and put out there in the universe as a matter of spiritual principle. And the last thing I want to share is about social service, destroying black families. I have had personal experiences with social service, teaming up with a white lawyer to prevent me from gaining custody of my children when I and my wife separated and got a divorce, and I sought custody of my children. I don't want to badmouth her, but I felt like she was in a place to where she could not raise the children properly and provide them with their needs. And social service, along with this white attorney that they had given her, really worked overtime to make me look as bad as possible in court. But my ex-wife finally came to her senses and realized that the children were better off with me, and so we didn't even have to go through the court. She just delivered the children to me and told me they'd be better off with you. So service once came out to our house because my sister and her husband, and they had 2 children, had split up, and he went and made a report on her like, the children were here and this house is crowded and I'm concerned about my children, And so this social service lady came out to the house, and white lady knocked on the door. I knew who she was because, they had the little emblem on the side of their little white cars. And so this white lady asked if she could come in, and I told her no. And she, insisted upon coming in, and I insisted upon telling her, no, you cannot come in, because all they want to do is come in and look around and make little notes about what they may see as being wrong or whatnot, and all they do is seek to destroy families. And so that mission is still ongoing, and if you see a problem, like you have a family member and you see an issue with the children and you think it's incorrect, it's best that you convene some kind of intervention with other family members and offer to help. Never call social service. My mom said she wouldn't call social service on her worst enemy because they are that destructive. They are interested in truth, and they have an agenda. All right. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Appreciate that. Did we miss anybody? Anybody who had a hand up who hasn't been able to share yet?
Hello, good night. Can I go?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, cool. Yeah, I read this book a long time ago. I was introduced to this book by my uncle when he was, putting me on this track to find out more about myself and the history of my people. So what stood out to me about this book when I read it was the turnaround Malcolm made from the sleeping with white women, the stealing, the criminal element, and just like completely remaking himself, and just uplifting himself to a level where he could also uplift his people. And that really stood out to me, you could do that. You can come from a place where you don't know yourself and reach a place where you can also influence people like you, and it's almost like, his father was a Garveyite, and, was a black nationalist talking about going back to Africa and stuff like that, owning your own black people owning businesses, you know what I mean, building a black community, you know what I mean, and look at that, you know what I mean, Malcolm came from that, and he made a turnaround, and in the end, he's basically promoting what his father talked about in the first place, you know what I mean, on an even global scale, you know what I mean, so, yeah, that's my input. Yeah, thanks, Gus, for letting me talk.
Do we miss anybody? Anybody who has not been able to share yet?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Greetings to Gus, listeners and callers. Just real quick, I noticed like how the use of words was being expressed, like especially through I think like colors and like terms black people use today. I think the narrator was saying how the word nigger was used towards them, like so much that I guess they began to get used to it or something. Like it was almost their names, like it was replaced with their names. And the term coon was used, and I guess it was defined for black people who were, going to search for watermelons, and it seemed like it was, a bunch of making fun of black people even at that time. And it just goes to show like how long that lasted, and the brain trashing and whatnot. And I noticed how the term black was used in reference to his father, and I think mulatto or whatever. I think that was used maybe to himself or his mother or something like that. And when I hear that word, I'm thinking like maybe like a mule or an animal or something like that. And I know the term dog tired, I think, was used like kind of like another animal reference. And the last couple of terms or parts in the first chapter was he described like a big black fly and like the big black hands. And he said, I think him, I guess, being lighter, I think he said he caught hell or something like that. And I don't know if that was exactly what was said. And then he said the mother told him to, I guess, go out and lay in the sun, almost like he should, burn or something like that. And that's kind of like a little synonymous, burning, and how people say burning hell and stuff. And the part about, I guess, the funeral where he was, he didn't like about the flower being put on his father's face, I guess because, the dust or something like that has a resemblance of white, and I guess he had a resentment toward that. So it's very interesting how, the color descriptions, at least, come to play, and how they're describing it. And that's pretty much all I have.
Did we miss anyone? Anyone not get an opportunity to share? Ooh, folks throwing their hands up late. I see the other person with a hand up. I will get your hand. Just some of the quick things that I thought were important. Number one, the scene where he talks about the stress that this put on his mother and father's marriage, where he says, my memories are a friction between my father and mother. They seem to be nearly always at odds. Sometimes my father would beat her. It might have had something to do with the fact that my mother had a pretty good education. Where she got it, I don't know. But an educated woman, I suppose, can't risk the temptation to correct an uneducated man. Every now and then, when she put those smooth words on him, he would grab her. That Mr. Fuller has talked about first time, last time. That should be ingrained, major, loud aspect of counter-racist codification. In my view, racists are to blame for all of this stress and frustration that we dump on each other. We have so many problems and pain, trauma that we're dealing with, and redirecting and focusing that on one another. But that's when we should be, that's passe. We have solved this problem. We don't have that anymore. First time, last time, and everybody can do their part to push that along. So that's one thing we can check off the list. Also thought it was important when he talked about, among the reasons my father had decided to risk and dedicate his life to help disseminate this philosophy among his people was that he had seen 4 of his 6 brothers die by violence, 3 of them killed by white men, including 1 by lynching. What my father could not know then was that of the remaining 3, including himself, only 1, my Uncle Jim, would die in bed of natural causes. Northern white police were later to shoot my Uncle Oscar, and my father was finally himself to die by white hands. The generations of terrorism that this family has experienced, and I remember I was on vacation in 2012, and my vacation happened to fall the weekend that Minister Malcolm X's grandson was killed. And I was talking about that, and I think we're supposed to be partying, but it had just happened, and I had just emailed him to be a guest on the program. He wrote me back and said, yeah, let's try and work out a date and time. I mean, I talked about this before, but at any rate, and I was just talking out loud about this, like the generation, like what happened to his father, Malcolm X's father, uncles, him, grandson, generations of terrorism, where you see white people, they have their children and they pick up the mantle, they pick it up right off where their white mothers, white grandfathers, white grandmothers, white aunties, they just pick up the mantle and continue their ongoing ceaseless war against black people. And the last thing, or I guess last 2 things, one, when they talk about epigenetics and the impact that terrorism and trauma can have on a person, just based on things that have happened to other people in your family. The very first sentence of chapter 1, when my mother was pregnant with me, she told me later a party of hooded Klan riders galloped to our home in Omaha, Nebraska. Just that right there. You're in the womb. And we've done whole programs about that as well. Shafia Monroe, the International Center for Traditional Childbearing, where so many black people, just from the womb, you're in this toxic and terroristic environment, and how that impacts our development. And the last thing that I'll say, this book starting off, I've read this book before more than once. This book starting off with this white guy, I thought was just massive act of racism right there. M.S. Handler, the paragraph in Peter Goldman's biography of Minister Malcolm about M.S. Handler, it reads that he is considered a veteran news reporter primarily associated with the New York Times. Malcolm X reportedly believed Handler had none of the usual prejudices or sentimentalities about black people. As a result, he entrusted Handler to write about ongoing developments in his political life as well as his changing outlook. Handler's stories concerned his break with the Nation of Islam, his journey to Mecca, his assassination, and the aftermath. He also wrote about issues relating to black nationalism, the political philosophy that cultivates pride in African origins. This in turn became a key factor in establishing a unified identity, social, economic, and political self-determination, and organized resistance to racism. This is from Peter Goldman's The Death and Life of Malcolm X. But I think something like that, in my view at least, shows the hand of racist man, racist woman, even when it is a black person who was willing to sacrifice their life to work against racism, white supremacy. It will be a suspected racist who gets the first word in your autobiography. The person who dialed in, I guess you're on the flash phone. Did you have something you wanted to share as well? caller on the flash phone? The number's not showing up. I'm just assuming you're on the flash phone. Did you have something you wanted to share? Last check. If you just called in more recently, you put a hand up, you wanted to share. Looks like you are on the flash phone. Did you have something you wanted to get in, or are you just listening? Okay, still not hearing you. I'm not sure if you have your line unmuted. If you're just listening, that's fine too. But you actually wanted to participate. We're not hearing you, so you can you maybe take a second, get your audio together, and then if you did want to participate, just put your hand back up and we'll get you after the second audio clip concludes. With that, we pretty much should be starting the second audio. If folks had other things that they wanted to get in, I'm sure this book will spark a lot for people. Just make a note. We should have ample time to share once the second sound clip concludes. Again, we are starting right at the beginning of chapter 2, regardless of whatever your page count is, beginning of chapter 2. We'll get started and then have time to hear from everybody once this concludes. The Autobiography of Malcolm X, Context of White Supremacy, Segment 2.
Chapter 2, Mascot. On June 27th of that year, 1937, Joe Louis knocked out James J. Braddock to become the heavyweight champion of the world. And all the Negroes in Lansing, like Negroes everywhere, went wildly happy with the greatest celebration of race pride our generation had ever known. Every Negro boy old enough to walk wanted to be the next Brown Bomber. My brother Filbert, who had already become a pretty good boxer in school, was no exception. I was trying to play basketball. I was gangling and tall, but I wasn't very good at it. Too awkward. In the fall of that year, Filbert entered the amateur bouts that were held in Lansing's Prudden Auditorium. He did well, surviving the increasingly tough eliminations. I would go down to the gym and watch him train. It was very exciting. Perhaps without realizing it, I became secretly envious. For one thing, I know I could not help seeing some of my younger brother Reginald's lifelong admiration for me getting siphoned off to Filbert. People praised Filbert as a natural boxer. I figured that since we belonged to the same family, maybe I would become one too. So I put myself in the ring. I think I was 13 when I signed up for my first bout, but my height and raw-boned frame let me get away with claiming that I was 16, the minimum age, and my weight of about 128 pounds got me classified as a bantamweight. They matched me with a white boy, a novice like myself, named Bill Peterson. I'll never forget him. When our turn in the next amateur bouts came up, all of my brothers and sisters were there watching, along with just about everyone else I knew in town. They were there not so much because of me, but because of Filbert, who had begun to build up a pretty good following, and they wanted to see how his brother would do. I walked down the aisle between the people thronging the rows of seats and climbed in the ring. Bill Peterson and I were introduced, and then the referee called us together and mumbled all of that stuff about fighting fair and breaking clean. Then the bell rang and we came out of our corners. I knew I was scared, but I didn't know, as Bill Peterson told me later on, that he was scared of me too. He was so scared I was going to hurt him that he knocked me down 50 times if he did once. He did such a job on my reputation in the Negro neighborhood that I practically went into hiding. A Negro just can't be whipped by somebody white and return with his head up to the neighborhood, especially in those days when sports, and to a lesser extent show business, were the only fields open to Negroes, and when the ring was the only place a Negro could whip a white man and not be lynched. When I did show my face again, the Negroes I knew rolled me so badly I knew I had to do something. But the worst of my humiliations was my younger brother Reginald's attitude. He simply never mentioned the fight. It was the way he looked at me and avoided looking at me. So I went back to the gym, and I trained hard. I beat bags and skipped rope and grunted and sweated all over the place. And finally I signed up to fight Bill Peterson again. This time the bouts were held in his hometown of Alma, Michigan. The only thing better about the rematch was that hardly anyone I knew was there to see it. I was particularly grateful for Reginald's absence. The moment the bell rang, I saw a fist, then the canvas coming up, and 10 seconds later the referee was saying 10 over me. It was probably the shortest fight in history. I lay there listening to the full count, but I couldn't move. To tell the truth, I'm not sure I wanted to move. That white boy was the beginning and the end of my fight career. A lot of times in these later years since I became a Muslim, I thought back to that fight and reflected that it was Allah's work to stop me. I might have wound up punching. Not long after this, I came into a classroom with my hat on. I did it deliberately. The teacher, who was white, ordered me to keep the hat on and to walk around and around the room until he told me to stop. That way, he said, everyone can see you. Meanwhile, we go on with class for those who are here to learn something. I was still walking around when he got up from his desk and turned to the blackboard to write something on it. Everyone in the classroom was looking when at this moment I passed behind his desk, snatched up a thumbtack, and deposited it in his chair. When he turned to sit back down, I was far from the scene of the crime, circling around the rear of the room. Then he hit the tack, and I heard him holler and caught a glimpse of him spraddling up as I disappeared through the door. With my deportment record, I wasn't really shocked when the decision came that I'd been expelled. I guess I must have had some vague idea that if I didn't have to go to school, I'd be allowed to stay on with the Gohannas and wander around town, or maybe get a job if I wanted one for pocket money. But I got rocked on my heels when a state man whom I hadn't seen before came and got me at the Gohannas and took me down to court. They told me I was going to go to a reform school. I was still 13 years old. But first I was going to the detention home. It was in Mason, Michigan, about 12 miles from Lansing. The detention home was where all the bad boys and girls from Ingham County were held on their way to reform school, waiting for their hearings. The white state man was a Mr. Maynard Allen. He was nicer to me than most of the state welfare people had been. He even had consoling words for the Gohannas and Mrs. Adcock and Big Boy. All of them were crying. But I wasn't. With the few clothes I owned stuffed into a box, we rode in his car to Mason. He talked as he drove along, saying that my school marks showed that if I would just straighten up, I could make something of myself. He said that reform school had the wrong reputation. He talked about what the word reform meant, to change and become better. He said the school was really a place where boys like me could have time to see their mistakes and start a new life and become somebody everyone would be proud of. And he told me that the lady in charge of the detention home, a Mrs. Swirling, and her husband were very good people. They were good people. Mrs. Swirling was bigger than her husband, I remember, a big, buxom, robust, laughing woman, and Mr. Swirling was thin, with black hair and a black mustache and a red face, quiet and polite, even to me. They liked me right away, too. Mrs. Swirling showed me to my room, my own room, the first in my life. It was in one of those huge dormitory-like buildings where kids in detention were kept in those days, and still are in most places. I discovered next, with surprise, that I was allowed to eat with the Swirlings. It was the first time I'd eaten with white people, at least with grown white people, since the Seventh-day Adventist country meetings. It wasn't my own exclusive privilege, of course, except for the very troublesome boys and girls of the detention home who were kept locked up, those who had run away and been caught and brought back or something like that. All of us ate with the Swirlings, sitting at the head of the long tables. They had a white cook helper, I recall, Lucille Lathrop. It amazes me how these names come back from a time I haven't thought about for more than 20 years. Lucille treated me well, too. Her husband's name was Dwayne Lathrop. He worked somewhere else, but he stayed there at the detention home on the weekends with Lucille. I noticed again how white people smelled different from us, and how their food tasted different, not seasoned like Negro cooking. I began to sweep and mop and dust around in the Swirlings' house, as I'd done with Big Boy at the Gohannas. They all liked my attitude, and it was out of their liking for me that I soon became accepted by them, as a mascot, I know now. They would talk about anything and everything with me standing right there hearing them, the same way people would talk freely in front of a pet canary. They would even talk about me or about niggers, as though I wasn't there, as if I wouldn't understand what the word meant. 100 times a day they used the word nigger. I suppose that in their own minds they meant no harm. In fact, they probably meant well. It was the same with the cook, Lucille, and her husband, Dwayne. I remember one day when Mr. Swirling, as nice as he was, came in from Lansing, where he'd been through the Negro section, and said to Mrs. Swirling right in front of me, "I just can't see how those niggers can be so happy and be so poor." He talked about how they lived in shacks, but had those big shining cars out front. And Mrs. Swirling said, me standing right there, "Niggers are just that way." That scene always stayed with me. It was the same with the other white people, most of them local politicians, when they would come visiting the Swirlings. One of their favorite parlor topics was niggers. One of them was the judge who was in charge of me in Lansing. He was a close friend of the Swerlins. He would ask about me when he came, and they would call me in, and he would look me up and down, his expression approving, like he was examining a fine colt or a pedigreed pup. I knew they must have told him how I acted and how I worked. What I'm trying to say is that it just never dawned upon them that I could understand that I wasn't a pet, but a human being. They didn't give me credit for having the same sensitivity, intellect, and understanding that they would have been ready and willing to recognize in a white boy in my position. But it has historically been the case with white people in their regard for black people that even though we might be with them, we weren't considered of them. Even though they appeared to have opened the door, it was still closed. Thus, they never did really see me. This is the sort of kindly condescension which I try to clarify today to these integration-hungry Negroes about their liberal white friends, these so-called good white people, most of them anyway. I don't care how nice one is to you. The thing you must always remember is that almost never does he really see you as he sees himself, as he sees his own kind. He may stand with you through thin, but not thick. When the chips are down, you'll find that as fixed in him as his bone structure is his sometimes subconscious conviction that he's better than anybody black. But I was no more than vaguely aware of anything like that in my detention home years. I did my little chores around the house, and everything was fine. And each weekend they didn't mind my catching a ride over to Lansing for the afternoon or evening. If I wasn't old enough, I sure was big enough by then, and nobody ever questioned my hanging out, even at night, in the streets of the Negro section. I was growing up to be even bigger than Wilford and Filbert, who had begun to meet girls at the school dances and other places, and introduced me to a few. But the ones who seemed to like me, I didn't go for, and vice versa. I couldn't dance a lick anyway, and I couldn't see squandering my few dimes on girls. So mostly I pleasured myself these Saturday nights by gawking around the Negro bars and restaurants. The jukeboxes were wailing Erskine Hawkins, Tuxedo Junction, Slim and Slams, Flatfoot Flugie, things like that. Sometimes big bands from New York, out touring the one-night stands in the sticks, would play for big dances in Lansing. Everybody with legs would come out to see any performer who bore the magic name New York, which is how I first heard Lucky Thompson and Milt Jackson, both of whom I later got to know well in Harlem. Many youngsters from the detention home, when their dates came up, went off to the reform school. But when mine came up, 2 or 3 times, it was always ignored. I saw new youngsters arrive and leave. I was glad and grateful. I knew it was Mrs. Swerlin's doing. I didn't want to leave. She finally told me one day that I was going to be entered in Mason Junior High School. It was the only school in town. No ward of the detention home had ever gone to school there, at least while still a ward. So I entered their 7th grade. The only other Negroes there were some of the Lyons children, younger than I was, in the lower grades. The Lyons and I, as it happened, were the town's only Negroes. They were, as Negroes, very much respected. Mr. Lyons was a smart, hard-working man, and Mrs. Lyons was a very good woman. She and my mother, I'd heard my mother say, were 2 of the 4 West Indians in that whole section of Michigan. Some of the white kids at school, I found, were even friendlier than some of those in Lansing had been. Though some, including the teachers, called me nigger, it was easy to see that they didn't mean any more harm by it than the Swerlins. As the nigger of my class, I was in fact extremely popular. I suppose partly because I was kind of a novelty. I was in demand. I had top priority. But I also benefited from the special prestige of having the seal of approval from that very important woman about the town of Mason, Mrs. Swerlin. Nobody in Mason would have dreamed of getting on the wrong side of her. It became hard for me to get through a school day without someone after me to join this or head up that, the debating society, the junior high basketball team, or some other extracurricular activity. I never turned them down. And I hadn't been in the school long when Mrs. Swerlin, knowing I could use spending money of my own, got me a job after school washing the dishes in a local restaurant. My boss there was the father of a white classmate whom I spent a lot of time with. His family lived over the restaurant. It was fine working there. Every Friday night when I got paid, I'd feel at least 10 feet tall. I forget how much I made, but it seemed like a lot. It was the first time I'd ever had any money to speak of, all my own, in my whole life. As soon as I could afford it, I bought a green suit and some shoes, and at school I'd buy treats for the others in my class, at least as much as any of them did for me. English and history were the subjects I liked most. My English teacher, I recall, a Mr. Ostrowski, was always giving advice about how to become something in life. The one thing I didn't like about history class was that the teacher, Mr. Williams, was a great one for nigger jokes. One day during my first week at school, I walked into the room and he started singing to the class as a joke, "Way down yonder in the cotton field, some folks say that a nigger won't steal." Very funny. I liked history, but I never thereafter had much liking for Mr. Williams. Later I remember we came to the textbook section on Negro history. It was exactly 1 paragraph long. Mr. Williams laughed through it practically in a single breath, reading aloud how the Negroes had been slaves and then were freed, and how they were usually lazy and dumb and shiftless. He added, I remember, an anthropological footnote on his own, telling us between laughs how Negroes' feet were so big that when they walk, they don't leave tracks. They leave a hole in the ground. I'm sorry to say that the subject I most disliked was mathematics. I've thought about it. I think the reason was that mathematics leaves no room for argument. If you made a mistake, that was all there was to it. Basketball was a big thing in my life, though. I was on the team. We traveled to neighboring towns such as Howell and Charlotte. And wherever I showed my face, the audiences in the gymnasiums niggered and cooned me to death, or called me Rastas. It didn't bother my teammates or my coach at all, and to tell the truth, it bothered me only vaguely. Mine was the same psychology that makes Negroes even today, though it bothers them down inside. Keep letting the white man tell them how much progress they are making. They've heard it so much they've almost gotten brainwashed into believing it, or at least accepting it. After the basketball games, there would usually be a school dance. Whenever our team walked into another school's gym for the dance, with me among them, I could feel the freeze. It would start to ease as they saw that I didn't try to mix, but stuck close to someone on our team or kept to myself. I think I developed ways to do it without making it obvious. Even at our own school, I could sense it almost as a physical barrier, that despite all the beaming and smiling, the mascot wasn't supposed to dance with any of the white girls. It was some kind of psychic message, not just from them, but also from within myself. I'm proud to be able to say that much for myself, at least. I would just stand around and smile and talk and drink punch and eat sandwiches, and then I would make some excuse and get away early. There were typical small-town school dances. Sometimes a little white band from Lansing would be brought into play. But most often the music was a phonograph set up on a table with the volume turned up high, and the records scratchy, blaring things like Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade, his band was riding high then, or the Ink Spots, who were also very popular, singing If I Didn't Care. I used to spend a lot of time thinking about a peculiar thing. Many of these Mason white boys, like the ones at the Lansing school, especially if they knew me well and if we hung out a lot together, would get me off in a corner somewhere and push me to proposition certain white girls, sometimes their own sisters. They would tell me that they'd already had the girls themselves, including their sisters, or that they were trying to and couldn't. Later on, I came to understand what was going on. If they could get the girls into the position of having broken the terrible taboo by slipping off with me somewhere, they would have that hammer over the girls' heads to make them give in to them. It seemed that the white boys felt that I, being a Negro, just naturally knew more about romance or sex than they did, that I instinctively knew more about what to do and say with their own girls. I never did tell anybody that I really went for some of the white girls, and some of them went for me too. They let me know in many ways, but any time we found ourselves in any close conversations or potentially intimate situations, always there would come up between us some kind of a wall. The girls I really wanted to have were a couple of Negro girls whom Wilfred or Filbert had introduced me to in Lansing. But with these girls, somehow, I lacked the nerve. From what I heard and saw on the Saturday nights I spent hanging around in the Negro district, I knew that race mixing went on in Lansing. But strangely enough, this didn't have any kind of effect on me. Every Negro in Lansing, I guess, knew how white men would drive along certain streets in the black neighborhoods and pick up Negro streetwalkers who patrolled the area. And, on the other hand, there was a bridge that separated the Negro and Polish neighborhoods, where white women would drive or walk across and pick up Negro men, who would hang around in certain places close to the bridge, waiting for them. Lansing's white women, even in those days, were famous for chasing Negro men. I didn't yet appreciate how most whites accord to the Negro this reputation for prodigious sexual prowess. There in Lansing, I never heard of any trouble about this mixing from either side. I imagine that everyone simply took it for granted, as I did. Anyway, from my experience as a little boy at the Lansing school, I'd become fairly adept at avoiding the white girl issue, at least for a couple of years yet. Then in the second semester of the 7th grade, I was elected class president. It surprised me even more than other people, but I can see now why the class might have done it. My grades were among the highest in the school. I was unique in my class, like a pink poodle, and I was proud. I'm not going to say I wasn't. In fact, by then I didn't really have much feeling about being a Negro because I was trying so hard in every way I could to be white, which is why I'm spending much of my life today telling the American black man that he's wasting his time straining to integrate. I know from personal experience. I tried hard enough. "Malcolm, we're just so proud of you," Mrs. Swerlin exclaimed when she heard about my election. It was all over the restaurant where I worked. Even the state man, Maynard Allen, who still dropped by to see me once in a while, had a word of praise. He said he never saw anybody prove better exactly what reform meant. I really liked him, except for one thing. He now and then would drop something that hinted my mother had let us down somehow. Fairly often I would go and visit the Lyons, and they acted as happy as though I was one of their children. And it was the same warm feeling when I went into Lansing to visit my brothers and sisters, and the Gohannas. I remember one thing that marred this time for me, the movie Gone with the Wind. When it played in Mason, I was the only Negro in the theater, and when Butterfly McQueen went into her act, I felt like crawling under the rug. Every Saturday, just about, I would go into Lansing. I was going on 14 now. Wilfred and Hilda still lived out by themselves at the old family home. Hilda kept the house very clean. It was easier than my mother's plight, with 8 of us always underfoot or running around. Wilfred worked wherever he could, and he still read every book he could get his hands on. Filbert was getting a reputation as one of the better amateur fighters in this part of the state. Everyone really expected that he was going to become a professional. Reginald and I, after my fighting fiasco, had finally gotten back on good terms. It made me feel great to visit him and Wesley over at Mrs. Williams. I'd offhandedly give them each a couple of dollars to just stick in their pockets to have something to spend. And little Yvonne and Robert were doing okay, too, over at the home of the West Indian lady, Mrs. McGuire. I'd give them about a quarter apiece. It made me feel good to see how they were coming along. None of us talked much about our mother, and we never mentioned our father. I guess none of us knew what to say. We didn't want anybody else to mention our mother either, I think. From time to time, though, we would all go over to Kalamazoo to visit her. Most often we older ones went singly, for it was something you didn't want to have to experience with anyone else present, even your brother or sister. During this period, the visit to my mother that I most remember was toward the end of that 7th grade year, when our father's grown daughter by his first marriage, Ella, came from Boston to visit us. Wilfred and Hilda had exchanged some letters with Ella, and I, at Hilda's suggestion, had written to her from the Swerlins. We were all excited and happy when her letter told us that she was coming to Lansing. I think the major impact of Ella's arrival, at least upon me, was that she was the first really proud black woman I had ever seen in my life. She was plainly proud of her very dark skin. This was unheard of among Negroes in those days, especially in Lansing. I hadn't been sure just what day she would come, and then one afternoon I got home from school, and there she was. She hugged me, stood me away, looked me up and down. A commanding woman, maybe even bigger than Mrs. Swerlin. Ella wasn't just black, but like our father, she was jet black. The way she sat, moved, talked, did everything, bespoke somebody who did and got exactly what she wanted. This was the woman my father had boasted of so often for having brought so many of their family out of Georgia to Boston. She owned some property, he would say, and she was in society. She had come north with nothing, and she'd worked and saved and had invested in property that she built up in value. And then she started sending money to Georgia for another sister, brother, cousin, niece, or nephew to come north to Boston. All that I'd heard was reflected in Ella's appearance and bearing. I had never been so impressed with anybody. She was in her second marriage. Her first husband had been a doctor. Ella asked all kinds of questions about how I was doing. She'd already heard from Wilfred and Hilda about my election as class president. She asked especially about my grades, and I ran and got my report cards. I was then one of the 3 highest in the class. Ella praised me. I asked her about her brother, Earl, and her sister, Mary. She had the exciting news that Earl was a singer with a band in Boston. He was singing under the name of Jimmy Carlton. Mary was also doing well. Ella told me about other relatives from that branch of the family. A number of them I'd never heard of. She'd helped them up from Georgia. They, in their turn, had helped up others. "We littles have to stick together," Ella said. It thrilled me to hear her say that, and even more the way she said it. I'd become a mascot. Our branch of the family was split to pieces. I'd just about forgotten about being a little in any family sense. She said the different members of the family were working in good jobs, and some even had small businesses going. Most of them were homeowners. When Ella suggested that all of us littles in Lansing accompany her on a visit to our mother, we all were grateful. We all felt that if anyone could do anything that could help our mother, that might help her get well and come back, it would be Ella. Anyway, all of us, for the first time together, went with Ella to Kalamazoo. Our mother was smiling when they brought her out. She was extremely surprised when she saw Ella. They made a striking contrast, the thin, near-white woman and the big black one hugging each other. I don't remember much about the rest of the visit, except that there was a lot of talking, and Ella had everything in hand, and we left with all of us feeling better than we ever had about the circumstances. I know that for the first time, I felt as though I had visited with someone who had some kind of physical illness that had just lingered on. A few days later, after visiting the homes where each of us was staying, Ella left Lansing and returned to Boston, but before leaving, she told me to write to her regularly, and she'd suggested that I might like to spend my summer holiday visiting her in Boston. I jumped at that chance. That summer of 1940, in Lansing, I caught the Greyhound bus for Boston with my cardboard suitcase and wearing my green suit. If someone had hung a sign, "Hick," around my neck, I couldn't have looked much more obvious. They didn't have the turnpikes then. The bus stopped at what seemed every corner and cowpatch. From my seat in, you guessed it, the back of the bus, I gawked out of the window at white man's America rolling past for what seemed a month, but must have been only a day and a half. When we finally arrived, Ella met me at the terminal and took me home. The house was on Waumbach Street in the Sugar Hill section of Roxbury, the Harlem of Boston. I met Ella's second husband, Frank, who was now a soldier, and her brother Earl, the singer who called himself Jimmy Carlton, and Mary, who was very different from her older sister. It's funny how I seem to think of Mary as Ella's sister instead of her being just as Ella is, my own half-sister. It's probably because Ella and I always were much closer as basic types. We're dominant people, and Mary has always been mild and quiet, almost shy. Ella was busily involved in dozens of things. She belonged to I don't know how many different clubs. She was a leading light of local so-called black society. I saw and met 100 black people there whose big city talk and ways left my mouth hanging open. I couldn't have feigned indifference if I'd tried to. People talked casually about Chicago, Detroit, New York. I didn't know the world contained as many Negroes as I saw thronging downtown Roxbury at night, especially on Saturdays. Neon lights, nightclubs, pool halls, bars, the cars they drove. Restaurants made the streets smell. Rich, greasy, down-home black cooking. Jukeboxes blared Erskine Hawkins, Duke Ellington, Cootie Williams, dozens of others. If somebody had told me then that someday I'd know them all personally, I'd have found it hard to believe. The biggest bands like these played at the Roseland State Ballroom on Boston's Massachusetts Avenue. One night for Negroes, the next night for whites. I saw for the first time occasional black-white couples strolling around arm in arm, and on Sundays when Ella, Mary, or somebody took me to church, I saw churches for black people such as I'd never seen. They were many times finer than the white church I had attended back in Mason, Michigan. There the white people just sat and worshipped with words, but the Boston Negroes, like all other Negroes I'd ever seen at church, threw their souls and bodies wholly into worship. 2 or 3 times I wrote letters to Wilfred intended for everybody back in Lansing. I said I'd try to describe it when I got back, but I found I couldn't. My restlessness with Mason, and for the first time in my life a restlessness with being around white people, began as soon as I got back home and entered 8th grade. I continued to think constantly about all that I'd seen in Boston, and about the way I'd felt there. I knew now that it was the sense of being a real part of a mass of my own kind, for the first time. The white people, classmates, the Swirlins, the people at the restaurant where I worked, noticed the change. They said, "You're acting so strange. You don't seem like yourself, Malcolm. What's the matter?" I kept close to the top of the class, though. The topmost scholastic standing, I remember, kept shifting between me, a girl named Audrey Slaw, and a boy named Jimmy Cotton. It went on that way as I became increasingly restless and disturbed through the first semester. And then one day, just about when those of us who had passed were about to move up to 8A, from which we would enter high school the next year, something happened which was to become the first major turning point of my life. Somehow, I happened to be alone in the classroom with Mr. Ostrowski, my English teacher. He was a tall, rather reddish white man, and he had a thick mustache. I'd gotten some of my best marks under him, and he had always made me feel that he liked me. He was, as I've mentioned, a natural-born advisor about what you ought to read, to do, or think, about any and everything. We used to make unkind jokes about him. Why was he teaching in Mason instead of somewhere else, getting for himself some of the success in life that he kept telling us how to get? I know that he probably meant well in what he happened to advise me that day. I doubt that he meant any harm. It was just in his nature as an American white man. I was one of his top students, one of the school's top students. But all he could see for me was the kind of future in your place that almost all white people see for black people. He told me, "Malcolm, you ought to be thinking about a career. Have you been giving it thought?" The truth is, I hadn't. I never have figured out why I told him, "Well, yes, sir. I've been thinking I'd like to be a lawyer." Lansing certainly had no Negro lawyers, or doctors either in those days, to hold up an image I might have aspired to. All I really knew for certain was that a lawyer didn't wash dishes, as I was doing. Mr. Ostrowski looked surprised, I remember, and leaned back in his chair and clasped his hands behind his head. He kind of half smiled and said, "Malcolm, one of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. Don't misunderstand me now. We all here like you. You know that. But you've got to be realistic about being a nigger. A lawyer? That's no realistic goal for a nigger. You need to think about something you can be. You're good with your hands, making things. Everybody admires your carpentry shop work. Why don't you plan on carpentry? People like you as a person. You'd get all kinds of work." The more I thought afterwards about what he said, the more uneasy it made me. It just kept treading around in my mind. What made it really begin to disturb me was Mr. Ostrowski's advice to others in my class, all of them white. Most of them had told them they were planning to become farmers, but those who wanted to strike out on their own, to try something new, he had encouraged. Some, mostly girls, wanted to be teachers. A few wanted other professions, such as one boy wanted to become a county agent, another a veterinarian, and one girl wanted to be a nurse. They all reported that Mr. Ostrowski had encouraged what they had wanted, yet nearly none of them had earned marks equal to mine. It was a surprising thing that I had never thought of it that way before, but I realized that whatever I wasn't, I was smarter than nearly all of those white kids, but apparently I was still not intelligent enough in their eyes to become whatever I wanted to be. It was then that I began to change. Inside. I drew away from white people. I came to class and I answered when called upon. It became a physical strain simply to sit in Mr. Ostrowski's class. Where nigger had slipped off my back before, wherever I heard it now, I stopped and looked at whoever said it, and they looked surprised that I did. I quit hearing so much nigger and what's wrong, which was the way I wanted it. Nobody, including the teachers, could decide what had come over me. I knew I was being discussed. In a few more weeks, it was that way, too, at the restaurant where I worked washing dishes, and at the Swirlins.
And that's where we will pick up at next week. There's a break in Chapter 2, so if you have the physical copy of the book, you can just flip through Chapter 2. You'll see there should be stars or something to demarcate a break after that sentence about in a few more weeks. It was that way, too, at the restaurant where I worked washing dishes and at the Swirlins break, and then we'll pick up next week in Chapter 2. That's it. Feel free to chime in. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. That number again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. My apologies, I got disconnected. So the people that were on the listening at Black Talk Radio Network, the audio might have went out for a second, but should be up if you called in or what have you. You should be able to go back and listen via Black Talk Radio Network without any difficulties. We will hit everybody who dialed in. I guess one quick point that I will get in, because I think he had said before about some of these quote unquote good whites, the Swirlins, and some of the others, that they called him nigger and they didn't mean it as an insult. In my view, just that designation means that they understand you're someone to be insulted, mistreated, whether they do it with a smile, whether they do it offering cornbread, trinkets, maybe even a job, a place to stay, sexual intercourse, whatever the case may be. Them understanding you, categorizing you, whether they do it verbally or in their head as a nigger, that implies a range of insults that may never be said, but will certainly be enacted upon you in all areas of people activity. I would just say that that's one to think on, and might even slide under the misunderstanding of what it means to be white, not fully understanding racism. But the insult is always there if you are classified as a nigger. That said, everybody who dialed in with a hand up, line should be open. If there's anybody who is with us who did not get an opportunity to share before, I guess we'll get you first to make sure you get your comments in. So anybody who did not get an opportunity to share during the first session that we had comments and what have you, anybody with a hand up who hasn't been able to share yet? Anybody?
Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I grew up in Lansing, and actually I read the book when I was in college, but, kind of listening to it now, it's just, I'm just thinking of, by the time I went to high school, Malcolm X had to be very famous, but I don't remember a single thing about him. I don't even think there's anything too much around Lansing right now that would say that he, had anything to do with the area, which I kind of find interesting. And when my dad actually, we lived in Lansing because he got a job at that Oldsmobile plant that they've mentioned. And I do remember him saying that he got so tired of, being called an N-word and all this stuff that was going on in that plant. One day and they would write stuff in the bathroom, put, graffiti, about black people, all kinds of stuff. And one day he wrote "forward country," and it kind of got them to jump on that instead of, being so racist for at least for a minute. And then he eventually, saved up some money and then opened up a body shop. In Lansing, but that was interesting. And now, if you had asked me before now that I experienced any racism when I was going to school, you'd say no. I would have told you no, but I'm thinking, when I was going into high school, we were selecting a program, and I said college prep because I was always, told I'm going to college. And my counselor told me to go home, get the newspaper, circle all the jobs I could find for secretaries, because he thought I'd be an excellent secretary, and look for any jobs that require college, and then come back. So I did it, and I went back, and I said, I still want to go to college. He said, why? It'd be much easier for you to get a job as a secretary. And I said, because I've always wanted to go to college, and that's what I'm going to do. And I had excellent grades. I had excellent test scores. I had a scholarship to go to the University of Michigan, so I think that was an act of racism that I never recognized while I was in the moment. And even how they, some of the kids acted. I think that color thing came up. My sisters and I, we all had really long hair, and that was way before weaves. And so, I guess that's why I never really fit in anywhere. I always, kind of kept to myself because I was bullied terribly. I remember one day, and this is the black girls, they they used to take me home and they beat me up and cut off all my hair and just all kinds of stuff. So we were kind of in an integrated area, but so it was kind of like maybe, I think it was like 30% black and 70% white, but just kind of you know, I don't know, now that I think about it, it wasn't really a nice place, but and really, even to this day, the only black people I really hang out with are in my family. So that might be why. And so that's all I really had to share.
Anybody who did not get to share during the first session where folks gave their commentary? Anyone who hasn't shared yet?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I saw the movie a long time ago, and I never read the book of Malcolm X. Just listening to it now reminds me of the book we had just read about I can't think of her name, but she was talking about the Moors, Maya Angelou's book. And I wish he kind of had, I can't remember him, I can't remember Spike putting this black woman, I think it was his family member, right? I don't remember him showing her part of that book when he was a child, when his mother was put in the asylum, so I don't think she was part of that movie. I think that would have been a pivotal point in his childhood to have at least show that, a black woman that was proud to be a black woman in that time. But I don't think I remember that in the movie. Or maybe it was one of those parts that ended up on the cutting room floor. Who knows? But I'm liking the truth about it, about the book. So far, the behavior of white people, and it also shows that he's astute to racism, but he's still, I would think, when he came back from Mecca, talking about white people are brothers in Islam and stuff like that. I think he would have changed his thought process after assessing his white brothers in Islam by by now. He would have definitely changed his thought process on that. But so far, I'm learning a lot, and it's I'm not too far from Lansing. I'm about an hour away from Lansing myself. And the same thing goes on here where I'm at. They went over there in Lansing, so they were part of that great migration as well when we all came up. Our families came up from Mississippi, hitting Detroit and hitting this place called Grand Rapids. So we're all part of that. You have black towns to the south of us. They were all black towns. Benton Harbor was a small town, and you had another town, Canopolis or something like that. But we pepper all throughout here, and then we got towns to the north of us. He's interesting so far. Interesting on how he's gonna. He's very well read. This is Malcolm X reading, right?
No, sir.
This is not Malcolm X. It sounds like him. Sounds like his voice. Oh shoot.
Well, we will leave it there so we can try and snag some of the other folks that called in as well. The person, anybody else who hasn't had a chance to share yet? Anybody who hasn't had a chance to share?
Yes, can I be heard?
I think I heard two female voices.
Oh, you can go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. It's Carmen. Thanks for picking up this book because I have not read this before, and I can tell you I was just so blown away by the beginning, and I'm just so saddened by listening to the strain that was visited on the mother, like threatening her through her children. And I said, oh my goodness, I need to check myself. I really need to check myself because I was just, usually I can process that, in a dissociative state. But that was just, to just, and I don't know if maybe this is a demonstration of that case where if you don't understand racism, everything else will only confuse you. But it seems like she should have understood enough to protect her psyche. No matter what the assault was, this is how racism rolls out. The fact that she was unable to protect her mind when it rolled out like it did, it makes me think that she really didn't understand it as well as she could. Just like Minister Malcolm says, most of this stuff I can see coming. So I'm fine. So, but I just think maybe there was something she was missing, but I just don't know what it could have been. And I'll have to say that Minister Malcolm was so much more aware at 14 because he's at 14 now. He's so much less confused than I ever was at 14. I'm just now figuring out racist tactics that were run on me when I was 8 and 9 and 10 just by looking at, the young ones here in school. And I'm saying, oh, same thing. But at 14, he was getting subtleties like, I'm a mascot, things like that. I think it just is a curiosity. I don't think anyone has ever survived falling into a septic tank. You would think, yeah, but no, that's a near drowning you don't come back from. So that thing about those people just falling in the outhouse and they were okay, that sounds kind of strange because, even if they do survive just the poop of an outhouse, they should still be sick for a long time. I think in Chris Kyle's book, they had a similar run-in with, poop in an outhouse, and that guy was in the hospital for a week. And the other thing he said about white people smelling differently, if you're not used to that smell, I'm pretty sure, I've never found it written I haven't seen anything to back it up, but I think it's because I have a saying that people have hair and animals have fur. Hair is curly and fur is straight. So they have what you call cysteine because of the kind of melanin they have, that red pheomelanin, and it has sulfur in it. And we don't have quite as much sulfur. And I think what we're smelling when it gets wet is that sulfur being, aromatized. So. But let me see what else. And I just, like I said, I mostly focus, see how that reflects things in my life. But, I remember all that government cheese. I remember all that government cheese, and I remember trying to get welfare, and they said you made too much money, and I said, but I'm still hungry. So, I remember all of that. And if somebody was giving away, if there was a way to get in line for some free food, I just can't see me having a problem with that. But I guess that's just me. So, anyway, those are my observations.
Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening to Gus and the callers. This is Jamie. So I finally got my husband on board to listen to one of the book studies. He was actually really excited that you guys were doing Malcolm X, having read it in his youth. I'd never read it, so I was really excited as well. And it's amazing already, but one of the observations that he made was in terms of the white boys at the school with Malcolm who just automatically assumed that he was sort of already experienced sexually, and that was something that my husband stated he had experienced as well, having attended a private Catholic school, like in 4th grade, them, peppering him with all of these questions about being with a woman or being with a girl, and having had sex with girls, and that, oh, you must be lying, you're not telling us, that, you have experience with these girls. And I mean, it's like fourth grade. I mean, what is that, like 9, 10 years old? So that was something that he certainly could relate to, and that I found quite astonishing because that seems very, very young to me. The other thing, I just actually had a question because Malcolm talking in the book about sort of being this mascot. Gus, you play this clip at times, and I haven't heard it in a while, but I think it's from a movie where I don't know the context, but it seems like it's maybe some prep school or something of that sort, and how the young man is saying, I assume the young non-white man is saying that, oh yeah, all the teachers are so nice to me. Everyone's just so nice. Everybody goes out of their way to make sure they say hello to me and that they, acknowledge me. But I know what they're thinking. And I was hoping that you could tell us where that was from, because I feel like I've seen or heard that before, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So I was hoping you could tell us that. But other than that, the book is already fantastic. I've highlighted a million passages already. So anyway, I'll mute myself, but if you can tell me about that, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The movie is Spinning into Butter, and that's like the climax scene. The film is almost reminds me of Dear White People, but the short version of the film is college campus. There's an accusation that someone is perpetrating racist acts against a black student, and they get to the final scene where the black student is with the white administration, and he's saying that all the white people on the campus are so nice to him, just as you said, and just call me a nigger. I prefer that as opposed to everybody just being over nice and trying to go out of their way to act like they are not racist in what they're thinking about me, even though they never say anything racist. That's the scene, but it's Spinning into Butter. Came out, I think, like 2009-ish or so. Anybody else that didn't get an opportunity to share yet?
Can we share a second time?
That I was just making sure that we didn't miss out on anybody who didn't get their first chance to share. But yes, the folks who are still with us who want to get their second chance in, absolutely. Anybody who didn't get a chance at all to share?
Hi.
Oops.
Hi, Green. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir. Let's get the female caller first. Somebody has a phone ringing in the background. That could.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Let me turn that off. One of the things that I did, I'm so sorry. Okay, so sorry. Yes, one of the things that struck me as far as understanding the institution of racism is Mr. Williams, his history teacher, just having the audacity to coming in the room and always making these racist jokes as not having any empathy for his feelings. It really just kind of tore me up hearing that this man he's supposed to be your teacher and he can just make racist jokes. I'm sure he didn't do it to the other kids there. Also, him talking about when he would go to different events with his classmates or his teammates, and he would say to himself, meaning that he didn't really want to get in the way. Also, it seems like Malcolm X was more of a stay-in-your-place Negro, because when he had that conversation in the class with Mr. Strakowski, he's in there by himself, and he's telling him, oh, Malcolm, you should, it's not realistic for you to be a lawyer. It's almost saying that, oh, if you be a lawyer, you'd be smarter than me, but you should just work with your hands. Although he was a dishwasher, here he becomes a class president. Usually in those positions, they would say, listen, Malcolm, you're too smart to be a dishwasher. Why don't you come along learn a business? So I knew right from there that, racism was being practiced. They just wanted Malcolm to stay in his place. And to hear Malcolm say he wanted to be white, I can understand his transformation from that. So I'm learning a lot. Thank you so much for your patience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anybody else we missed? Anybody who hasn't had an opportunity to share at all?
Yes. Greetings, Tab.
Yes, sir.
One of the things that stuck out to me was the introduction, the racist suspect that wrote the introduction, and his position. Him saying, talking about how he viewed Malcolm, or really kind of almost talking like in the third person, talking about other white people and how other white people saw Malcolm, and how they kind of went through these stages. First, they were almost fascinated with his oratory, the way that he could deliver and articulate himself, and then how they became scared of him, of what he said, and then third, they just saw him as a devil. That stuck out to me, and also how he also spoke about, in so much that I think through the various white people that have come and have visited the cows, you kind of see that same pattern. Not necessarily that they end up at that same place, just thinking about black people as devils, but these mental jumps that they make, and how they keep trying to, they're not honest. They don't want to really deal with the truth, especially about the Princeton mom, when she was on a few weeks back. And also for the way that he just spoke about his feelings, even writing the introduction, having known and read the whole book, and still to have, the position that he took is really, really interesting to me. So I just wanted to share that. And also I read this book back in high school, and I was in New York around the time when the Tawana Brawley case was new, when Amadou Diallo was shot, while a lot of these things were going on, Howard Beach. And I read this book in a predominantly white school at the time, and we didn't spend a lot of time on the book, which stuck out to me as well, but it caused a profound shift in my consciousness at that time in the late 80s. So that was all I really wanted to share.
Appreciate that. Did we miss anybody? All righty. I would assume we nabbed everybody who had a hand up who hasn't been able to share. So the people who have already shared, if you have any other comments you want to get in, feel free.
Yes, Gus, I wanted to, this Scotty again, go back to something you said about, about white terrorism, and just observing all of this white terrorism that he's talking about going on in Michigan. I have actually written about my own experiences with white terrorism in Detroit as an 11-year-old boy, along with two of my teenage cousins being chased by a white mob. And there just seems, maybe it's because I'm not aware of documentaries or other books about white terrorism in the North, but most of the documentaries or books, or whenever white terrorism is spoken about, they mostly focus on South, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina. But indeed, terrorism goes on all across the United States, and it continues to this day. So anywhere you are in the north, south, east, or west, you can be subjected to white terrorism. And so that kind of stuck out to me when you made those comments about, the white terrorism. Getting whooped by a white boy. You don't go back, you don't get whooped by a white boy and show your face in the black community. I remember that. Once we came back to North Carolina, being in middle school, and that's just something that you didn't want to happen. If you got in a fight with one of these white boys, you did not want to get beat up, because you would never live it down. All right, they're gonna pick at you. Reform schools. Malcolm was talking about the reform schools in their first segment. I remember in Detroit in the 1970s. A reform school for all black boys. I remember that distinctly, because we went to school with some of those guys. They went to public school and whatnot, and we were asked, we find out, oh, you live there, I forget the name of, I think it was Cobo Hall or something like that. But yeah, those reform schools were still operating in the 1970s in Detroit. Another thing that stuck out to me, two more things, but this one stuck out to me because I just talked about it today about affirmative action. Malcolm talked about, they say they opened the door, but the door is really closed. that we can use that to describe affirmative action today. They're saying that affirmative action opens up the door to higher education, opens up the door to positions in these corporations and whatnot. But as people who listen to this program know, the primary beneficiary of affirmative action has been the white woman. Okay, so they say that they open up this door through affirmative action, but really it's closed because, the white women is coming through and they're shutting it behind them. The last thing I wanted to share is, and it's also a question. It just reminds me, again, I always give credit to my mom. She's a big influence on my life. She is the first one that taught me about racism as a young child. But as I became older, Malcolm would be the next biggest influence on me in terms of racism, learning about racism and how it works. And he, used the term good white people. Oh, these good white people, they're even polite to you, allow you to eat at the table with them and everything, but you're still just a nigger. You're still just a nigger to them. And so let's not forget that. And so I had to ask, I don't know if that's something, it's only through this program that I became aware of the teachings of Neely Fuller. And I still haven't gotten the code book. That's on the to-do list, but I listen to a lot of the video clips that are posted when he gives interviews and things of that nature. And I wonder if he ever has talked about Malcolm X being an influence on him. Because a lot of things from my studies of Malcolm, it seems that Mr. Fuller also touches upon those same things. And so I'm wondering if Mr. Fuller has ever spoken on Malcolm being an influence on him. Thank you.
Just quickly, he has, and he's talked about having seen him in person more than once. You'd have to, twist my arm to pick out the specific programs, but I know he has talked about seeing him in person and, some of the other observations from that time period. Anybody else who maybe you already shared, but you had another comment you wanted to get in?
Yeah.
Let's get the female caller first.
Thank you. I have them bullet pointed, so I'll try to keep it quick. Just the title of this chapter alone was enough for me. It summed up this chapter entirely. He fought so hard to try to be on the white team, but quickly realized he could really only be their mascot. On page 106, the third paragraph, to me it demonstrated just talking about how different children that were in the home, like some of them got to eat at the table and how much of a privilege that was, and the other ones, the other black children who actually tried to run away, like runaway slaves, were locked up. Found that very interesting, how you still considered it a privilege to be able to eat at their table. The next page, the whole description of how they would act around him, constantly using the word nigger, talking about him while he was there, like as though he wasn't there. Even the judge who was in charge of looking after him, kind of eyeballing him and nodding in approval whenever he saw him, like as though he owned Malcolm. He was checking up on his stock. That entire thing just kind of made me wonder what it's like for non-white children who have been abducted, adopted currently, if they have to face sort of a more refined situation like that. Also, the bottom of 107, he states how it has historically been the case with white people that even though we might be with them, we weren't considered of them. That, of course, Ellen says they never did really see me. That definitely brings up the whole colorblind rhetoric. In particular, it reminded me of the white female and Mr. Green that you had on the program Wednesday. And thank you. And then the very next page after that, going off what Mr. Reed was saying about the reform schools, I found it really interesting that he didn't have to go to that reform school because essentially his reform school was supposed to be the Swirling household. And his reforming and changing him to make him better was to make him a good nigger who does his chores, chucks and jives, brings the Swirlings all their good attention by him doing so well in school and being nominated as the class president, all of that just shines on the swirling, because no one really changed how they actually viewed Malcolm. Like I said, it's more of a testament to the swirling household than his own intelligence and his manner. And the last thing I wanted to touch on is, like it has been stated multiple times on this show, once you become even slightly aware of the system of white supremacy, white people recognize it, take note that you are not fulfilling their expectations of being a regular nigger, just happy to be getting attention from them. And that's all I had.
Greetings again. Some course of time, someone mentioned about not having any understanding about Malcolm's experiences in Lansing. Primarily because most of his counter-racist activities didn't come about until he was in the Nation of Islam, and then his activities were in some like Detroit, and mainly in New York City and Harlem. But anyway, he developed in his childhood and teenage years a vast experience around white people in social home atmospheres, which is, I would say, during that period of time, probably wasn't, the majority of non-white black people weren't involved in that type of setting with white people in that close. So therefore he developed a good experience around white people and learned not to trust white people, no matter how nice they were. That was indicated in this last chapter. One more thing about the beginning chapter of the book. I've heard an interesting story on how that took place. This book, the interest of creating this book was basically from it was a series of articles and also a television program that came on with Mike Wallace, documentary on the Nation of Islam called The Hate That Produced Hate. I think it came around from like 1960, something like that. And in turn, it became some sort of interest in the Nation of Islam. And in turn, when Alex Haley approached Malcolm about this book, Malcolm didn't have a whole lot of trust for Alex Haley, mainly because he worked in popular news magazines such as Playboy and Reader's Digest, and he basically just was speaking about the Nation of Islam and Islam itself, and that's not really what Alex Haley wanted to hear. But he noticed, because he will come over to his studio sometimes as late as 12 midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning after he finished working all day long, and he would sit and they would just talk. But Alex Haley noticed he would leave scrap sheets of paper around the apartment from the talking, and Alex Haley would study the sheets of paper, and he put it all together. And when this one particular point in time, when Malcolm showed up for an interview, Alex Haley asked the question, "What about your mother?" And as was mentioned in the first chapter, on how very sensitive he was to his mother, when Alex Haley said that, it kind of opened up and started talking about himself. And that's basically how that first chapter, from my understanding from reading many different books on Malcolm X, on how that first chapter started. I thought it was pretty interesting on that, as far as that's concerned. But that's all I have to say right now.
May I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to, speaking about his mother, I'm a young widow too, and I can understand what she went through. I only had one child, and it was just very overwhelming. I had, all kinds of family all around me, and it was, it was something so difficult I wouldn't even wish it on my worst enemy. So I can't imagine how she even survived as long as she did without the life insurance. It's like, trying as hard as you can, and just, there's no room to breathe anywhere. So I can understand how eventually she just, kind of caved in with, especially since she really didn't have any support that I could tell. That since they never mentioned that there were any family, I guess a few friends, but just no one. So I can understand what she went through and how she ended up the way she did.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to say one last thing. I wanted to not let the program end without mentioning Ella Little, his sister. I think that she was an important character in his becoming less confused when he had met her and saw that she was, in his words, she was jet black, but the way she moved and talked and did everything, it just emulated something, positive to him that made him probably look inward, because he was going through a point in his life to where he was realizing that he was being mistreated. And although he had not become less confused at that time, he was going through that transition. And I think that from her strength and from her positive image and the role models that she possessed, helped him to formulate new identity. I'm your point.
We will leave it there. Grand have the participation from all of the folks. Think we'll be on this for the length of the book. I think we should be on this until April. So folks can buckle up, take notes if you want to do some research as we're moving along. That would be grand. Kind of sprinkle that in as we go. There's so many documentaries and other books and speeches and all that good stuff. I guess be mindful over the next week. Next Saturday is the 50-year anniversary of his assassination. I don't know if that's getting as much attention as a lot of the other 50-year anniversaries that people have been talking about over the last few years. The March on Washington, assassination of JFK, many of those events that are going to be coming up in this book as we move along. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. At any rate, we will pick back up on it next Friday, same time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Will be kind of midpoint of Chapter 2 for folks to follow along. Shouldn't be very difficult at all for you to get your hands on a copy of this book, any version you like. I'm sure you can probably go to a used bookstore and get a copy for 50 cents. At any rate, we will be back tomorrow, the compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. News, workplace racism over the past 7 days. Definitely looking forward to hearing from folks there. I will say quickly, as we exit, number one, I had reminded someone, I think about 2 years ago. It's been a little bit more than 5 years, I guess, since the last time I read this book. And I was telling someone the no sex with white people. I was like, I think that's in Malcolm X's autobiography. I think there's a lot of that would support no sex with white people. And I think just what we heard this week already is leading in that direction. And there's a lot more to come. That was definitely one. And then briefly, just the portions that reminded me of some of the other biographies that we've done with Madiba, him too, wanting to be a boxer, and Joe Louis. And I think he's going to pop back up again in this book also reminded me of Dr. Maya Angelou, who was a friend of Minister Malcolm. The significance of Joe Louis, that's something that we've heard before on this program as well. Anywho, we will be back in about 24 hours. Remain safe, remain codified. Under conditions of white terrorism, sobriety would be best. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all areas of people activity, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cows signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.